If you were magically dropped into a Georgian country house, the first thing you'd notice is that everything above stairs looks like it was designed by someone who hated fingerprints, loved symmetry, and believed furniture existed purely to intimidate visitors. Polished banisters gleaming like fresh frosting. Portraits of ancestors who stared at you like you owed them money. Carpets so soft you wondered if the sheep had been bribed. But shift your weight slightly, inch your foot toward a narrow door tucked discreetly behind a staircase. That door. The one everyone pretends isn't there. And suddenly the world changes. Because that is the entrance to below stairs, the humming, sweating engine room that kept Georgian grandeur functioning. Up there, society's stage. Down here, backstage where the real show happens, and where no one is allowed to complain about the script. The good news, you're indoors. The bad news, you're basically living in the house's basement lungs. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Below stairs was a world designed with military precision and zero decorative ambition. Smooth plaster walls, plain wooden floors, oil lamps flickering like exhausted fireflies. This was a place built for durability, not beauty. The hallways were narrow because every scrap of space had a purpose. The ceilings were low because heating a tall one was expensive. And the air was, well, let's just say that if freshness were a spectrum, the servants' quarters would exist somewhere near warm bread left inside a shoe. But this was the point. Below stairs wasn't meant to be seen by the family or their guests. Georgian society believed that servants should enable luxury without ever polluting it by, existing in plain sight. So the architecture reflected that. The house had dual ecosystems, one elegant, one functional. And the two were connected by a maze of hidden corridors, cramped staircases, and doors that blended into the walls so perfectly you'd swear the carpenters had been paid in gilt. Every great house had its unique layout, but certain rooms appeared everywhere, like recurring characters in a long-running drama. First, the servants' hall, the communal hub, buzzing from before dawn until after midnight. Long wooden tables, heavy benches, a fireplace that always seemed one log away from giving up. This was where servants ate, talked, received instructions, and occasionally fantasized about running away to become highwaymen. It was never glamorous, but it was the heart of below-stairs life, the one place where everyone, from the butler to the lowest hallboy, passed through eventually. Next was the butler's pantry, a room so sacred to order and polish it might as well have been a shrine. Shelves of gleaming silver, each piece catalogued, counted, and guarded like holy relics. The air smelled faintly of metal polish and the fear of fingerprints. This was the domain of the butler, and even dust respected him enough not to settle here. Nearby you'd find the housekeeper's room, often the neatest place below stairs. Ledgers, keys, fabric samples, and the air of a woman who could micromanage you into another century. She ruled quietly but absolutely. If the butler was the king of below stairs, the housekeeper was the prime minister, powerful, organised and less forgiving. Then came the kitchen, a room that lived in its own climate zone. Hot, smoky, noisy, and always a smelling of something that was either delicious or dangerous. Copper pots hung overhead like shiny battle trophies. A giant hearth dominated the room, and if you stood too close, you risked becoming an appetizer. But this wasn't just a kitchen. It was a factory of meals, a place where food for dozens was prepared daily by people who were simultaneously sweating, hurrying, and politely cursing at vegetables. Radiating out from these central rooms were the smaller, task-oriented spaces, the scullery, where water splashed perpetually, the laundry room, where steam turned humans into wrinkled prunes, the wine cellar, cold enough to store regrets, and the servants' bedrooms, closets masquerading as living quarters. Everything down here ran on movement. Bells rang constantly, literally, thanks to elaborate bell systems connected by wires that snaked through the walls. Each bell chimed differently, and servants learned to recognize them like parents identifying their children's cries. The upstairs world was always summoning, demanding, expecting. Below stairs answered. But perhaps the most striking thing about this underground kingdom was the invisible divide, the one unspoken rule that shaped every moment. Servants existed to support the illusion of effortless elegance above. Georgian society depended on this duality. Guests cooed over polished floors that took hours of labour. They marvelled at perfectly orchestrated dinners that required military-level coordination. They complimented the quiet efficiency of the household, while never considering that beneath their feet were 20 exhausted people sprinting like it was the Olympics. Below stairs wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was indispensable. Without the constant work happening here, every Georgian mansion would collapse into chaos within half a day. The servants weren't just employees, they were the house's circulatory system, pumping labour into every room until the entire structure functioned like a living, breathing organism. A tired, overworked organism that smelled faintly of coal dust and cabbage. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it now, the clang of pots, the scrape of boots, the distant ringing of a bell, and the whispered conversations of people who kept the Georgian world turning, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. Before anyone ever polished a fork, stoked a fire, or carried a tray with the elegance of a swan in formal wear, they had to complete the first terrifying step of Georgian domestic service, getting hired. And make no mistake, this was not a simple matter of showing up, smiling, and hoping not to trip over a potted plant. Securing a servant position was a delicate dance of reputation, references, desperation, and the occasional miracle. In a world where career mobility meant moving from one household's basement to another's, everything began with your character. Georgian employers wanted servants who were honest, obedient, hard-working, sober, pleasant, quiet, invisible, and ideally capable of telepathy. Skills were helpful, but what a master truly desired was a servant who would not steal the silver, criticise the family portraits, or flee after 2 weeks because the house had too many stairs, a legitimate complaint. But how did you convince a wealthy employer that you were trustworthy? Simple. Letters of recommendation, the most powerful documents in a servant's life. These letters were written by your former employer, assuming you parted on not hostile terms, and they were essential. A good reference could change your life. A bad one could make you unemployable faster than sour milk in July. A reference was not a polite bonus, it was your golden ticket. Without one, you were more suspicious than a muddy footprint outside the wine cellar. With one, you stood a chance of being hired into a respectable household, rather than ending up in temporary service, itinerant labour, or your cousin's inn where the walls shook every time a horse sneezed. But references could be painfully honest. If you were lazy, prone to sarcasm, or had once screamed at a rooster during early morning duties, your employer might generously phrase your reference as willing though inexperienced, or spirited in ways both advantageous and challenging. And if someone wrote the death sentence of servant references, she did her best. Your career was over. For those just starting or recovering from the world's worst reference, the next step was the hiring marketplace. On market days, hopeful men and women lined up in the square like a Georgian job fair, but with more aprons and significantly less optimism. Servants stood in their best clothes, gripping their reference letters like battle shields, ready to be inspected by prospective employers who wandered through the crowd evaluating posture, hands, and expressions. Hands mattered a great deal. Soft hands meant you hadn't worked a day in your life. Damaged hands meant you had worked too much and might collapse in the doorway. The ideal candidate's hands were that mystical middle ground, capable, calloused, and unlikely to drop the family's china. If the marketplace didn't deliver, you could turn to agencies and registries, early employment offices that kept lists of available servants. Of course, these agencies also took fees, and sometimes those fees ate so much of your first month's wages that you wondered whether the agency was your real employer. Then came the interview, a harrowing ritual performed in the home of the prospective employer. You would be led into the servants' hall, or sometimes, insultingly, made to sit in the kitchen while the cook judged your worth through the steam rising from a boiling pot. Interviews were swift and brutally practical. Questions might include, can you polish silver? Have you fainted recently? Are you terrified of geese? Correct answer, yes, everyone is. Appearances were assessed. Mannerisms were scrutinized. Your posture determined whether you could be trusted to carry a tea tray. Your tone of voice suggested whether you would scare the children. A servant who spoke too boldly risked being labelled impertinent. One who whispered risked being mistaken for a ghost. It was a delicate art. If you passed the interview and did not spill anything, break anything, insult anything, or step on any decorative spaniels, you entered the negotiation phase. Although negotiation is a generous term, since the wages were already determined and the only real question was whether you'd accept the offer. Spoiler, you would. Georgian servants rarely had the luxury of turning down employment unless they enjoyed the challenge of being deeply theatrically poor. Wages varied wildly depending on the position. A footman wearing fancy livery earned more than a maid who scrubbed floors until her soul left her body. The butler and housekeeper were paid the most below stairs, but even their salaries would not inspire jealousy from anyone who enjoyed food, heating, or the ability to sit down occasionally. Still, wages weren't everything. Room and board made service economically viable. You might not earn much, but at least you weren't paying rent for a space the size of a wardrobe. For many young people, especially women, domestic service was the primary path to stability, however exhausting it might be. A good position offered security, food, and the faint hope of rising through the ranks. Or, if you were extraordinarily lucky, marrying the footman with nice hair. But employment wasn't guaranteed. A single bad reference, a rumour, or even a mistaken identity could sabotage your prospects. Worse, employers sometimes exaggerated flaws simply to replace servants without guilt. One unjust comment on a reference letter could echo through your entire career. Georgian service was a ladder, but one with many broken rungs. Still, for those who succeeded, stepping into service meant entering a complex, tightly controlled world with its own rules. Expectations and culture, a world waiting for them just beyond the kitchen door. If you thought the Georgian aristocracy upstairs was obsessed with rank, titles, and who had the right to stand closest to the teapot, wait until you meet the servant hierarchy below stairs. Down here, order wasn't merely important, it was oxygen. Without it, the household would collapse faster than an overboiled pudding. Hierarchy mattered. Even the dust motes knew their place. Life below stairs functioned like a miniature kingdom, complete with rulers, middle managers, aspiring professionals, and exhausted peasants. Every servant had a clear position, a distinct set of duties, and an unspoken understanding that you never, ever cross certain boundaries unless you wished to be launched out of the household with the efficiency of a well-aimed broom. At the top of this underground kingdom stood the butler, calm, dignified, and capable of detecting a crooked candlestick from 50 paces. He was the supreme authority in all matters of household order. He managed the wine cellar, guarded the silver, and kept the keys, literally and metaphorically. The butler was expected to embody restraint, poise, and the sort of quiet confidence that made even the master of the house hesitate before criticising the table settings. He was also the chief disciplinarian below stairs, able to quell disputes with a single raised eyebrow. Rumour had it that a truly experienced butler could stop a footman mid-breath. But the true internal power player, the one whose influence ran through every corner of the household, was the housekeeper. If the butler was the king, she was the prime minister, the treasury, and sometimes the secret police. She controlled the linens, the cleaning supplies, the household budget, and the morale of every maid. Her keys clinked like the sound of approaching judgment. She inspected rooms with the precision of a general reviewing troops and maintained standards so high that even dirt felt ashamed. Underestimate the housekeeper, and you were destined for a short career and a long list of regrets. Next in command was the cook, whose authority was measured in heat, knives, and the terror she could inspire in anyone who dared stand between her and a boiling pot. The cook dictated the kitchen's rhythms, managed ingredients, and ensured meals emerged in pristine Georgian order. She didn't just run the kitchen, she ruled it. Footmen tiptoed around her domain like nervous cats. Maids feared dropping anything within her line of sight, and the scullery maid essentially lived inside the gravitational pull of her demands. The saying went, the butler may keep the house running, but the cook keeps the household alive. Below these titles of service were the specialists, the staff whose roles were defined by precision, performance, or perpetual motion. Footmen, for instance, were chosen for height, attractiveness, and the ability to hold decorative trays without trembling. They attended the family, opened doors, served meals, and performed ceremonial duties. They were the visible servants, the polished ornaments of the household machinery. But do not be fooled. Beneath their elegant livery was a young man whose social status depended entirely on how silently he could pass through a dining room without causing a single spoon to quiver. Then there were the housemaids, each with clearly defined responsibilities based on rank. The upper housemaid maintained the finer rooms, handling delicate fabrics, expensive furniture, and the sort of dust that seemed determined to die dramatically on surfaces. The under housemaids cleaned hallways, bedrooms, staircases, and anything else that stood still long enough to gather grime. Their lives were a cycle of dusting, sweeping, adjusting curtains, and praying no one spilled anything sticky. Hovering slightly above the realm of exhaustion were the ladies' maids and valets, personal attendants to their employers. While technically below stairs, they interacted with the family more frequently and enjoyed certain privileges. They handled clothing, grooming, and personal care, often becoming walking encyclopedias of fashion disasters and family secrets. They were trusted, but also scrutinized. Proximity to power is always a double-edged candle snuffer. And then, deeper in the hierarchy, past the point where hope begins to wilt, you reach the youngest and hardest work servants. Hallboys were the domestic world's apprentices. Their responsibilities included running errands, cleaning the boots of every human in the household, carrying coal, and enduring constant orders. They slept near the servants' hall, ready to leap into action whenever a senior servant shouted, "Boy," which was approximately 8,000 times a day. But even they outranked the true bottom rung of Georgian service, the scullery maids. These were usually very young girls who worked harder than anyone, but received the least recognition. Their world revolved around boiling water, scrubbing pans, scouring plates, scraping pots, and handling every slimy disaster the kitchen invented. Their hands were permanently pink from hot water, and permanently pruny from being submerged in it. They were the first awake, the last to sleep, and the ones everyone yelled for when something spilled. The scullery maid did not simply occupy the lowest position in the hierarchy, she anchored it. These ranks weren't merely symbolic, they shaped every aspect of below-stairs life. Who sat where during meals, who spoke first during meetings, who carried keys, who polished which object, who answered which bell. Everything followed the ladder of authority. Even something as minor as who could walk through the corridor first mattered. If a footman encountered a housemaid coming the other way, she stepped aside. If a hallboy approached anyone important, he practically jumped into the nearest wall. And naturally, where rank exists, politics thrive. Below stairs, alliances formed over shared chores, whispered frustrations, and mutual fear of senior staff. Tensions simmered when someone received a promotion or a better uniform. Rumours thrived like enthusiastic mould. And all the while, the hierarchy kept everyone in check, ensuring that, even during moments of chaos, the household never lost its rhythm. Below stairs wasn't just a workplace, it was its own society, rigid, complex, and tightly wound. A world where everyone knew exactly who was above them, who was below them, and how many steps they needed to climb before someone finally stopped shouting their name. If there is one universal truth about Georgian servants, it is this. They did not wake up in the morning, they woke up before it. Long before it. So early, in fact, that even the sun would have filed a complaint for harassment if it could. The entire household's performance depended on an invisible, unending choreography, and that dance began in darkness, cold, and the faint hope that no one had spilled anything overnight. A servant's day did not ease into existence. It erupted. Around 4 a.m, while the gentry slept soundly under embroidered quilts large enough to function as sails, the servants opened their eyes to a far less luxurious reality. A cramped room, a stiff mattress, and the quiet awareness that their to-do list was already waiting to ambush them. Only the very highest-ranking servants below stairs could sleep slightly later, and even they weren't lounging until sunrise unless they fancied unemployment. The first figures to rise were often the under-housemaids, creeping through dark corridors like exhausted ghosts. Their opening task? Rekindling the fires. Not glamorous, not gentle, but essential. Every hearth in the house, sometimes dozens, needed to be brought back to life before the family awoke. This required scooping ash, hauling coal, arranging tinder, and blowing on embers until each room regained the illusion of effortless warmth. By 5 a.m, the lower floors were alive with footsteps, clanks, and the rhythmic sigh of someone already regretting the day. Next came lamp and candle duties. Housemaids trimmed wicks, refilled oil lamps, and polished glass chimneys so the upstairs rooms glowed like civilized havens rather than caves run by confused bats. The family never noticed this work, which meant it had been done correctly. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, still cold enough at dawn to threaten frostbite even in July, the first spark snapped inside the great hearth. The scullery maid was already awake. She didn't have the luxury of sleeping until 4. Her day began somewhere around ungodly o'clock. Boiling water for washing and scouring yesterday's last dishes. And as pots clattered against stone, she silently reconsidered every life decision that had led her here. Around 6 a.m, the cook entered, bringing with her the authority of a small deity and the energy of someone who had already shouted at 3 people that morning. Breakfast needed preparation, porridge, coffee, bread, rolls, whatever the household demanded. Servants frequently ate leftovers or simple fare, but the family expected their breakfast to whisper sophistication even before dawn. Down the hallway, the butler and footman began their morning rituals. The butler inspected the silver, prepared the dining table, and ensured that all bottles, decanters, and glasses gleamed correctly. The man could spot a smudge so faint it would take a microscope to perceive it. The footman polished boots, brushed coats, folded napkins, and arranged cutlery with the precision of a military engineer. Breakfast would not be served for hours, but appearances took time. By 7 a.m, the house hummed like a factory wearing petticoats. Now came the bed-making, chamber pot emptying, rug beating, curtain straightening, and general resurrection of the household from the destruction caused by the previous day's living. If a maid moved quickly, she could refresh half a dozen rooms before the slightest rustle hinted that a member of the family was waking up. Because once the family was awake, everything changed. After 8 a.m, servant work became a delicate ballet, bead without sound. A footman might race across the hallway silently enough to impress a cat. A maid could vanish behind a door the instant she heard footsteps on the staircase. And if a servant was unexpectedly spotted by a guest, they bowed, curtsied, apologized, and evaporated faster than steam. As the family took breakfast amour, the servants above stairs performed their roles with theatrical grace. The footman stood at attention, the butler oversaw the proceedings, and the maid slipped in and out like whispers. Meanwhile, below stairs, the remaining servants scarfed down their own breakfast, swiftly standing up between duties, and occasionally while still holding something breakable. Late morning brought new waves of tasks, preparing luncheon, ironing clothes, mending fabrics, polishing surfaces, setting fires, running errands, and occasionally stopping long enough to remember what sunlight looked like. Servants lived in a continuous cycle of nearly behind schedule, definitely behind schedule, and so behind schedule the laws of time have reversed. By noon, the footmen were back at the dining table, the maids were hauling laundry, and the cook was commanding the kitchen with increasing volume. The scullery maid's hands were now permanently submerged in water, and the hall boy was sprinting between floors like a human carrier pigeon. Afternoon brought only a momentary pause, and calling it a pause is generous. Servants might catch 5 minutes to gulp tea, repair a tear in their apron, or contemplate rebellion before returning to laying out clothes for dressing, serving tea upstairs, and preparing the house for evening activities. Evening was a performance. Dinner service required absolute precision. Polished glassware, perfectly aligned forks, footmen moving in synchronized patterns like finely dressed migratory birds. Behind the scenes, the heat of the kitchen rivaled volcanic activity as the cook orchestrated courses with the fury of a conductor whose orchestra was made entirely of pots. And when the family finally retired for the night, the servants' day still wasn't over. After 10 p.m, fires needed banking, lamps extinguished, kitchen scrubbed, dishes soaked, floors swept, silver rechecked, and the breakfast table partially prepared for the next morning, because in Georgian service tomorrow starts just as today ends. It wasn't until midnight that the last servants crept into bed, and even then sleep was rarely peaceful, because in only 4 short hours it would begin again. If you've ever complained about doing housework, congratulations. A Georgian servant would like to gently place a mop in your hands and invite you to reconsider your life choices. Because in a Georgian great house, cleaning wasn't a chore, it was a full-body lifestyle. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, but it was definitely next to back pain. Every surface, nook, groove, and suspiciously decorative object required attention. Dust in a Georgian home didn't simply collect, it strategically multiplied, as if holding board meetings overnight to decide where best to be discovered by the mistress of the house. So the servants fought back with an arsenal of brushes, cloths, buckets, soap, sand, vinegar, and sheer human stubbornness. The day's first major cleaning ritual was hearth maintenance, because Georgian families adored fireplaces with the same enthusiasm that modern families reserve for complaining about heating bills. Every room had one, sometimes several, and each came with its own mountain of ash. Before the family rose, the housemaids had to scoop out yesterday's soot, avoid inhaling half of it, then rebuild the fire with fresh coal. This meant kneeling on hard floors, bending into fireplaces, and emerging covered in enough smudges to resemble a cheerful Victorian chimney sweep in training. Next came chamber pots, the unglamorous centerpiece of bedroom hygiene. Each morning maids collected, emptied, rinsed, and cleaned these porcelain reminders that indoor plumbing was still centuries away from being polite enough to exist. Some pots were light and easy, others were personality-filled. And if a guest had overindulged the night before, let's just say the chamber pot revealed all secrets. No one thanked the maid for this service. No one wanted to make eye contact about it. But the work had to be done quietly and invisibly, so that the family could pretend their bodily functions politely waited until daylight. Then it was time to conquer rugs and carpets, those dusty carpets of despair that swallowed soot, crumbs, mud, hair, and the existential dread of every servant who saw them. There were no vacuum cleaners, no electricity, no miracle sprays, only knees, brooms, and the raw determination of someone who knew the mistress of the house would absolutely notice a single speck of lint. Rugs weren't just swept, they were beaten, dragged outside and struck repeatedly with wooden frames until enough dust flew out to create a small weather event. And then, just when a servant thought they'd defeated the dust, someone walked across the rug and undid an hour of their life. Staircases, of course, deserved their own daily purification ritual. Georgian stairs were showpieces, wide, grand, winding, and designed to impress anyone who climbed them. Unfortunately, they were also magnets for dirt. Housemaids polished banisters until they gleamed dangerously, swept every step, scrubbed corners, and wiped away the smudges left by children, dogs, or adults who refused to use handkerchiefs. A well-maintained staircase looked effortless, which was ironic because nothing required more effort than convincing wood to look naturally shiny. But the real battle took place on surfaces, so many surfaces. Wooden tables, gilded frames, shelves, decorative statues, mirrors, candlesticks, cabinets, and anything else the master had bought simply because it sparkled under candlelight. Dust was relentless. One moment the surface looked pristine, the next, a thin layer reappeared like it had been delivered by express service. Housemaids dusted with soft cloths, horsehair brushes, feathers, and occasionally their own sleeves when time was short. Cleaning a Georgian house wasn't about tidying, it was about preserving a fantasy. The family believed their home was naturally refined, clean and welcoming, as if dust took one look at the aristocracy and politely bowed itself out of existence. The truth was that the servants scrubbed, swept, polished, rinsed, beat, wiped and wrestled every surface into compliance. Then came the hardest skill of all, polishing the unpolishable. Silver tarnished faster than dignity at a gambling house. Brass dulled overnight. Wood lost its shine if anyone breathed near it too forcefully. The solution? Endless polishing. Footmen and housemaids rubbed wax into furniture, buffed candlesticks, shined doorknobs and polished silver trays until they reflected their own exhausted faces back at them like tiny metallic prophecies. Furniture wax smelled faintly of lemons and suffering. Silver polish emitted fumes that could knock out small insects. But the work was addictive in its own tragic way. Once polished, an object shone gloriously for approximately 17 minutes. Then a human touched it, or dust dared settle, and the entire cycle began again. And heaven forbid a mirror was streaked. A streaked mirror was a crime, a moral failing, a sign of collapse. Housekeepers treated streaks as if they were personal insults delivered by enemies. A maid caught leaving streaks risked being reassigned to tasks so dreadful that she would learn to polish glass with monk-like devotion. Not to be overshadowed, floors demanded constant care. Wooden floors were scrubbed, sanded, waxed and buffed by hand, sometimes on all fours for hours. Stone floors were mopped and rinsed until they gleamed like medieval banquet halls. Even carpets required grooming with stiff brushes to maintain their fibres. Every floor had its personality, and none of them liked being ignored. Georgian cleaning wasn't merely physical labour. It was strategy, endurance and diplomacy. Dirt was the enemy, but so were time, mess, absent-minded family members and gravity itself. A servant might spend an hour cleaning the drawing room only for a single gust of wind to deliver a fresh layer of dust from the street. Such was the eternal truth of domestic service. No matter how much you cleaned, the house always wanted more. But despite the never-ending cycle, servants became experts at reading the house's moods. They knew which rooms gathered dust fastest, which fireplaces smoked too much, which rugs trapped debris like they were auditioning for a museum exhibit, and which decorative items seemed to exist solely to make cleaning difficult. The house was not a home, it was a demanding creature, and every day the servants cleaned it back into civility. Step into a Georgian kitchen, and you are stepping into a world that is equal parts battlefield, bakery, steam bath, and opera stage. This was the cook's kingdom, a realm ruled not by gentle domestic charm, but by heat, knives, noise, impatience, and a queen whose word was law. The kitchen was hot enough to roast meat and your hopes simultaneously. Unlike the refined dining rooms upstairs, the kitchen existed in a storm of sensory overload. The air shimmered from the giant hearth, fires crackled like angry beasts, pots boiled with furious enthusiasm, and the sheer smell, a swirling cloud of spices, roasting meats, stewing vegetables, and whatever had been spilled last, could knock an unsuspecting visitor backward. This was no quiet room for leisurely culinary arts. It was an industrial engine designed to feed a household, staff, visitors, unexpected guests, hunting parties, and occasionally people who simply wandered in at the wrong time and expected a snack. At the centre of it all stood the cook, a figure of immense authority and very limited patience. She, and occasionally he, though women dominated this role, managed the kitchen with the precision of a military general and the temperament of a weather system. She was up before dawn, planning the day's meals, checking supplies, consulting recipe books, and shouting instructions at a volume that suggested she had been born inside a thunderstorm. The cook knew every corner of her domain intimately. She knew how hot the hearth needed to be for roasting, how much spice a family preferred, which pans had dents that made them heat unevenly, and which herbs could cover the taste of meat that had aged enthusiastically. Her mind held a rotating catalogue of recipes. Soups, sauces, pastries, roasts, porridges, custards, puddings, jellies and delicacies whose preparation time seemed better suited to a full-time construction crew. Her authority extended far beyond food. She controlled the flow of labour in the kitchen, who chopped, who stirred, who fetched, who washed, and who should immediately leave her sight before she used a ladle to make her point clearer. Even the butler treated her with careful diplomatic respect, because while he oversaw the household's ceremonial polish, the cook oversaw its survival. The kitchen equipment looked like it had been designed by a blacksmith who desperately wanted you to fail. Heavy copper pots that weighed as much as a toddler, iron cauldrons large enough to bathe a small horse, spits for roasting meat that required constant turning, done by a servant who would rather be anywhere else, mortars and pestles for grinding spices, cleavers sharp enough to frighten ghosts, and pastry moulds shaped like animals, crowns, and architectural landmarks because Georgian cuisine did not believe in simplicity. Then there was the hearth, the roaring, thundering centre of everything. Forget modern stoves with dials and temperature settings. A Georgian cook managed heat with instinct, experience, and a healthy respect for fire's desire to destroy everything. The hearth produced astonishing meals, but it also created hazards. Flying sparks, scorching heat, the smoke that clung to walls and lungs, and the ever-present risk of a dish catching fire in a dramatic but inconvenient flourish. The smoke was its own beast. It curled through the air, settling into clothing, hair, and the souls of anyone who spent too long near it. Servants often emerged from the kitchen smelling like smoked meat. And that was on a good day. Amid this chaos, the recipe books, those treasured tomes passed down through generations, offered guidance. But Georgian recipes were written less like step-by-step instructions and more like mysterious riddles. Cook until done, season to taste, or add a modest amount of butter. A phrase that could mean anything from a tablespoon to half a cow's worth. So the cook relied on instinct, memory, and the kind of experience earned only by years of being burned, shouted at and tested by pastry dough that refused to cooperate. The kitchen also operated on a strict timetable. Breakfast dishes needed to be ready precisely on time. Luncheon preparations began even before breakfast was served. Dinner, the crown jewel of Georgian meals, took hours of chopping, simmering, kneading, marinating, roasting, glazing, and arranging with decorative flair. A single dinner could include multiple courses, soups, fish dishes, meat dishes, pastries, puddings, and fruit arrangements that looked like they were sculpted by Michelangelo's hungry cousin. And accidents happened. Oh yes, they did. Pot handles snapped off. Dough refused to rise. Puddings collapsed with the sound of culinary despair. Sometimes a goose escaped its fate and chased a footman around the room. The cook responded to these disasters with the swift emotional range of a seasoned professional. Outrage, denial, furious improvisation, and finally triumph most of the time. Life inside a Georgian kitchen wasn't just labour, it was performance. The cook performed creativity under stress, artistry under heat, discipline under noise. And despite the exhaustion, despite the burns and cuts and constant shouts, the kitchen developed its own unique camaraderie, a rhythm, a pulse, a sense of belonging in the middle of wild chaos. Because beneath all the sweat and smoke, the kitchen was the heart of the house. The family above stairs might have believed their world ran on elegance, propriety, and carefully curated appearances, but the truth was simpler. The household ran on food. Good food, hot food, food that appeared on the table as if summoned by magic, when in reality it had been wrestled into existence by a cook whose willpower could have powered the entire estate. So yes, the kitchen roasted more than meat. It roasted patience, expectations, and occasionally the eyebrows of anyone standing too close to the fire. If the Georgian household was a great and complicated machine, then the scullery maid was the gear that kept turning no matter how much pressure was thrown onto it. She was the lowest-ranked servant, the most overworked, the least thanked, and the most essential. If it needed scrubbing, boiling, or cursing at, the scullery maid did it. Her day didn't start early. It started before early, before the housemaids rose to tackle the fires, before the cook stormed into the kitchen like an approaching weather front, before any reasonable human being should be conscious. The scullery maid slipped out of bed in the deep dark, already knowing her hands would be submerged in hot water within minutes. Georgian kitchens demanded constant motion, and the scullery maid was the one who supplied it. Her first task of the day, boiling water, endless, merciless, back-breaking boiling of water. Without modern plumbing, every basin, bucket, pot and tub had to be filled manually. She hauled water from the pump or courtyard cistern, carried it inside, poured it into heavy pots, and hoisted them onto the range or hearth. The water boiled, it cooled, it spilled, it boiled again. Her arms became strong out of necessity, not choice. From the moment the first pot simmered, her hands were at work, and they didn't stop for the next 16 hours. The scullery maid lived in a world of dirt, grease, and things previously cooked, but now unidentifiable. The cook and kitchen maids prepared dishes, chopped vegetables, shaped dough, and basted meats. But after a single meal, mountains of pots, pans, knives, ladles, bowls, spits, plates, platters, spoons, trays, moulds, and mysterious kitchen implements descended upon the scullery like an avalanche made of metal and despair. Some pieces were light and easy, others were cast-iron monstrosities so heavy they could be used as weapons if morale ever broke completely. Spit rods were coated in sticky layers of meat drippings that required fierce scrubbing. Pastry moulds carried burnt bits that clung with the dedication of barnacles. Copper pans tarnished if someone even thought the word humidity. And all of it landed in the scullery maid's sink. She scrubbed with sand, lye soap, stiff brushes, and pure determination. Harsh soaps cracked her skin. Hot water scalded it. Cold water froze it. Metal edges cut it. Over time, her hands became tough, red, and permanently wrinkled. Proof that constant water exposure respects no one. If washing dishes were her only task, the scullery maid might still have remained sane. But Georgian households had a special talent for producing side quests. She scoured floors, crawling on hands and knees with a bucket of murky water and a scrubbing brush that clearly hated her. She polished kettles, sometimes until her reflection stared back with a look that said run. She cleaned ovens, removing ash and soot so thick they could have been packed and sold as artisanal charcoal. She washed vegetables, fish, and occasionally small tragedies masquerading as spills. And then there was laundry, the endless punishing marathon of boiling linens, stirring them with wooden paddles, rinsing them repeatedly, and hauling heavy wet sheets to be wrung out by hand. Laundry devoured hours, drained strength, and guaranteed that every part of the scullery maid's body would hurt by the end of the day. Heated air and hot water mingled into clouds of steam, turning the laundry area into a sauna nobody asked for. Even the location of her workspace emphasised her low rank. The scullery wasn't a pleasant room. It was often tucked into the coldest, dampest, darkest part of the kitchen area. Drafts crept through cracks, mice occasionally visited. Rainwater dribbled in if the weather was dramatic. The stone floor stayed cold year-round, and standing on it all day numbed her feet until she forgot what warmth felt like. She was summoned constantly. If the cook yelled, she answered. If a footman dropped a tray, she cleaned it. If a maid needed hot water, she fetched it. If a kitchen maid was behind schedule, she absorbed the overflow. The scullery maid learned quickly that her own tasks never ended. It was everyone else's emergencies that decided her pace. And it wasn't just the physical strain, it was the thanklessness. The cook received credit for meals, the butler for order, the housekeeper for management. Even housemaids occasionally received compliments for a particularly shiny table. But no one ever looked at a gleaming pot and said, "My goodness, the scullery maid has surpassed herself today." Her work only drew attention when something went wrong, and heaven help her if a speck of grease escaped detection. Yet despite this, the scullery maid was indispensable. Without her, the entire kitchen collapsed. No cookware meant no cooking, no boiling water meant no washing, no cleaning, no preparing. The scullery maid was the engine inside the engine. a constant invisible force that kept chaos at bay. Her only respite came in the smallest pockets of time, a stolen moment to breathe near an open door, the satisfaction of seeing a burnt pan restored to brightness, the rare kindness of another servant slipping her extra bread, the pride of surviving another day in a role designed to break lesser spirits. By nightfall, her muscles ached, her hands throbbed, and her clothes hung heavy with steam. And yet she still had more pots to wash after dinner, more stains to attack, more water to haul. When she finally crawled into bed, her sleep was not peaceful, it was unconsciousness wearing the disguise of rest. But in the hierarchy of Georgian service, the scullery maid's suffering laid the foundation for everyone else's success. The household's grandeur depended on her unseen labour, and though she occupied the lowest rung, she held up half the house. If the scullery maid lived at the very bottom of the Georgian household hierarchy, the footman occupied a very different kind of spotlight, one requiring height, charm, balance, immaculate posture, polished shoes, and the ability to stand still for so long that one might suspect they photosynthesized. A footman wasn't hired for his brains. He was hired because he could stand still and sparkle. These young men were the aristocracy of the servant class, decorative, uniformed, perfectly arranged, and intentionally visible. Georgian society adored footmen because they embodied elegance, living ornaments who made the household look prosperous and impossibly well managed. A wealthy family didn't simply employ a footman, they displayed him, the way modern people display luxury cars or designer handbags. Uniforms were central to this decorative function. A footman's livery was a work of art. Brightly coloured coats with elaborate buttons, crisp breeches, perfectly fitted waistcoats, gleaming buckles, powdered hair, and sometimes even silk stockings if the household wanted to flaunt its wealth. The richer the family, the flashier the livery. It was basically fashioner's financial statement, worn by someone who had no choice but to look impeccable even when he hadn't slept since Tuesday. But the uniform wasn't just for show. Every detail served a purpose. Buttons needed polishing until they shone like miniature suns. Shoes needed buffing until they risked blinding guests. Hair powder had to be evenly applied so no servant looked like he'd been attacked by a flour mill. Through constant maintenance of his appearance, the footman broadcast a message. This household is glorious, wealthy, and never ever messy. And indeed, the footman's work revolved around presentation. His duties included setting tables with precision sharp enough to qualify as a science. Forks, knives, and glasses weren't just placed, they were aligned, measured, and spiritually harmonized. A dinner table set by a well-trained footman could bring a tear to a Georgian hostess's eye, and if anything sat a fraction of an inch off, a footman's career trajectory could tilt dangerously downward. Serving meals required even more skill. Each dish was offered with smooth, graceful movements. Posture had to remain perfect. Footsteps silent, eyes attentive but unfailingly neutral. A good footman could serve soup without making a sound, refill wine without interrupting conversation, and maintain the elegant facial expression of someone who absolutely did not overhear the family arguing about inheritance or the quality of last season's peaches. When he wasn't serving meals, the footman polished everything. Candlesticks, silver platters, bell handles, banisters, sconces, boots, wine coolers, snuff boxes, basically so. If it could hold a reflection, the footman became personally responsible for ensuring that reflection did not show dust, fingerprints, emotional despair, or signs of yesterday's dinner. His very existence required polishing, of objects, of image, and of reputation. Of course, looks mattered, and Georgian employers did not hide this. A tall, handsome footman was a status symbol. The more physically impressive your footman, the richer you appeared. Guests noticed, neighbours compared, gossips whispered, and footmen, aware of their decorative value, often held a curious mixture of pride and humiliation. They were important, but for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual personalities. Yet a footman was not simply decorative furniture with legs. His job involved endurance, both physical and emotional. He had to stand for long periods, during dinners, during receptions, during afternoon tea, during evenings when the family decided to host a sudden gathering. Hours upon hours of quiet, upright stillness. His feet ached, his back burned, but his expression remained serene, like a marble statue that had taken etiquette lessons. Then there were the errands. A footman might spend half his day running up and down stairs, answering bells, fetching letters, carrying packages, escorting guests, delivering hat boxes and retrieving shawls. Georgian houses were enormous, and footmen became accidental athletes, sprinting between floors at speeds that would impress modern fitness coaches. Footmen also handled carriages, riding in the rear step during travel and helping passengers in and out. This made them visible to the public, which conveniently advertised the family's wealth. It also meant freezing in winter, sweating in summer, and looking perfectly composed in every season. Rain, wind, dust storms. The footman stood firm, regretting all life choices, but never revealing that fact on his face. Socially, footmen lived in an awkward limbo. They were among the highest-ranked male servants below stairs, often enjoying better meals, nicer quarters, and slightly higher wages. But their upward mobility was limited. Many dreamed of becoming butlers, but only those with exceptional discipline and a forgiving temperament managed to climb that far. Meanwhile, they had to navigate the admiration they received from some servants and the jealousy they provoked in others. Footmen also developed reputations, not always fair ones. Some were rumoured to be vain, others too flirtatious, some supposedly slow-witted, others too clever for their own good. Because the footman's role was visible, every misstep could become household gossip within minutes. Drop a platter? Everyone knew. Spill wine? The incident was remembered for years. Smile too broadly at a dinner guest? Scandal. Look too handsome in the sunlight? Double scandal. Despite these pressures, footmen often found companionship among each other. They shared polishing tricks, gossip, jokes, and the universal understanding that standing still required unnatural levels of core strength. They formed a peculiar brotherhood of men whose job was to be seen but not heard, admired but never acknowledged as equals. For all its strange requirements, the footman's role was considered respectable, even enviable, among servants. It came with dignity. Uniforms, public presence, and occasional admiration from guests who treated footmen with a courtesy rarely shown to other staff. But beneath the decorative veneer lived a young man who worked hard, trained constantly, and upheld the household's image with every movement he made. If Georgian footmen were decorative, polished, and admired, the maids of all work were the exact opposite: invisible, overworked, and indispensable. They were the household's emergency response team, chaos managers, fill-in specialists, and the living embodiment of multitasking long before anyone invented the word. They did every job except relaxing. That one was forbidden. A maid of all work wasn't merely busy. She lived in a perpetual state of being one task behind. She was the Swiss Army knife of domestic labour, called upon whenever the household needed something done immediately, quietly and with a smile that suggested she absolutely wasn't about to collapse. Unlike specialised servants, the cook who commanded the kitchen, the footman who guarded elegance, the scullery maid who scrubbed existence itself, the maid of all work possessed no single defined role, which meant she had every role. Her daily routine, a mystery because it changed constantly. If you asked her what she did each day, she might respond, everything. And this would not be an exaggeration. Her morning began in the same early, uncivilized hours as everyone else below stairs, but whereas other servants had their own assigned domains, fires, laundry, kitchen, prep, the maid of all work took orders from everyone. Housekeeper, yes. Cook, yes. Butler, yes. Footman, sometimes. The family, often. Gravity, certainly. Fate, always. Her morning might start with cleaning bedrooms, sweeping every corner, before sunlight revealed the sins of dust and carelessness. Then she might sprint downstairs to help the housemaids with laundry, then rush to the kitchen to fetch hot water for washing, then carry trays upstairs for family breakfast, then return to the scullery to retrieve dishes, then dart back up to make beds, then run back down to gather firewood because the parlour needed fresh logs. And that was just before 10 a.m. The maid-of-all-work was the household's flexible labour unit, expected to appear wherever short-handedness struck. Too much soot in the drawing room? She cleaned it. Extra guests arriving unexpectedly? She prepared rooms. Someone dropped a tray into the hallway. She swept it. The dog escaped and tracked mud through the corridor. She chased, scolded, wiped, and pretended none of it had ever happened. She worked across all floors, below stairs, ground level, family chambers, guest rooms, and she navigated them with the harried speed of someone trying to escape a maze designed by a bored architect. One of her greatest challenges was clothing care. While ladies' maids tended to fine garments, the maid-of-all-work often handled lesser items, aprons, linens, stockings, undergarments, and garments that had mysteriously acquired stains nobody wished to explain. She fetched water, boiled it, scrubbed fabric on washboards, wrung out heavy linens, and hung garments to dry, only for the weather to turn traitorous and force her to bring everything back in again. Her responsibilities extended into food service. She ran plates to the kitchen, delivered tea trays, carried coal to heat water, set up small meals for children, delivered messages between floors, and occasionally peeled vegetables with the speed of someone defusing a bomb. Running between floors defined her existence. Georgian homes were tall, sprawling, filled with stairs that twisted, narrowed, widened, and bent around corners. And the maid-of-all-work travelled them all, often at top speed. Her legs grew strong not because she wished them to, but because stairs ruled her life like a vengeful monarch. If she wasn't carrying something up, she was carrying something down. Laundry, trays, notes, cleaning supplies, coal scuttles, candles. The house was a never-ending shuttle system, and she was the shuttle. One of the greatest ironies of her position was that because she worked everywhere, she belonged nowhere. She had no designated room like the cook, no authority like the housekeeper, no visible role like the footman. She floated, always needed, rarely acknowledged. Her work was measured not by what she accomplished, but by the lack of things going wrong, and the house gave her plenty of chances to fix things that went wrong. Chimney smoking? She fetched the tools. Window stuck? She wiped and coaxed until it obeyed. Child crying? She found the toy. Guest faint? She fetched water. Candle leaning? She straightened it. Shoes missing? She searched every room in the house and eventually found them under the sofa where no reasonable person would have put them. Her greatest enemy was time. Every task had to be done immediately, perfectly, and invisibly. Master and mistress expected rooms to be immaculate before entering them. Guests expected service without delay. Senior servants expected obedience without hesitation. She learned to predict needs before anyone voiced them, anticipating spills, reading faces, and noticing problems the instant they arose. Yet amidst all this Herculean labour, she also faced the social isolation of her position. Because she had no fixed specialty, she lacked the camaraderie that came from working on a team. She floated between groups, housemaids, kitchen staff, footmen, scullery workers, always welcomed, never fully belonging. Her friendships were made in snatched conversations, brief jokes exchanged in corridors, and shared sighs over the day's mounting demands. Despite the physical and emotional toll, many maids-of-all-work saw their job as a stepping stone. If she survived long enough, she might rise to upper housemaid or laundry maid, positions with clearer responsibilities and slightly less sprinting. She might even save enough to leave service entirely, though such dreams were easily crushed by the next urgent shout of her name. Still, she learned resilience, speed, skill, and a strange kind of humour born from exhaustion. Because sometimes, at the end of a long day, the only thing she could do was laugh at the absurdity of having fetched water, polished a table, soothed a crying child, hunted down a runaway chicken, and delivered tea, all before lunch. She was in many ways the backbone of the house, always moving, always adjusting, always filling the gaps so others could perform their roles smoothly. The maid-of-all-work did not rest, she merely paused very briefly until someone called for her again. In the bustling ecosystem of a Georgian household, where every servant had a defined place and a mountain of work designed to test the limits of human endurance, one figure stood above the storm, unruffled, dignified, and armed with an impenetrable aura of composure. This was the butler, the calm master of chaos. A good butler knew everything, especially things you wished he didn't. He moved with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced because it was woven into every polished surface of the home. If the household were a ship, the butler was its steady captain, steering through daily crises with serene confidence, while keeping the crew from smashing into the metaphorical rocks of disorder. His domain was the pantry, but not the pantry of snacks and forgotten jam jars. This pantry was the treasury of the household, a sanctuary of silverware, crystal glass, porcelain, linen, and meticulously organised tools of ceremonial elegance. Imagine shelves lined with gleaming platters, wine decanters reflecting the lamplight, and cutlery arranged with the care of a curator, preserving ancient artefacts. This was the butler's kingdom, and he guarded it as fiercely as any dragon guarding its hoard. One of his most vital responsibilities was the silver. It wasn't just tableware, it was a symbol of the family's prestige. The butler counted it regularly, polished it with near-religious devotion, and knew instantly if anything was missing, tarnished, or slightly out of alignment. His relationship with the silver bordered on emotional. He trusted it, understood its moods, and occasionally glared at it when it misbehaved. No piece escaped his attention. If the family owned a 12-piece silver fish set, the butler could identify each piece in a lineup. Next came his authority over the keys. Georgian houses were full of locked doors, cellars, pantries, linen closets, wine stores, storage rooms, and occasionally secret spaces that had no documented purpose whatsoever. Every lock had a key, and every key belonged on the butler's ring, a heavy jingling symbol of his responsibility. He kept track of these keys with supernatural precision. Lose one, and the household spiraled into mild panic. Misplaced two, and the butler contemplated early retirement. But keys weren't just metal, they represented trust. The master and mistress entrusted the butler with access to everything valuable, edible, or stealable. A butler's reputation depended entirely on his reliability. A single scandal, a missing bottle of wine, an unaccounted-for silver ladle could shatter a career built on decades of perfection. Perhaps the most challenging part of his job was managing the staff. The butler was the supervisor, mediator, disciplinarian, and occasionally therapist of the servant world. He ensured that footmen maintained their posture, that housemaids adhered to cleaning standards, that hallboys didn't collapse from fatigue and public view, and that the kitchen delivered meals precisely when the family expected them. He fielded complaints from staff, resolved disputes, and maintained harmony in an environment bursting with personalities, egos, exhaustion, and the occasional dramatic rivalry. The butler had to navigate these dynamics without ever raising his voice. A quiet reprimand from him carried more weight than a shouted order from anyone else. His presence alone could halt chaos. A footman leaning too casually in the hallway quickly straightened when the butler appeared. A maid fixing her cap suddenly remembered her posture. Even the cook, whose temper could boil water, respected the butler's calm authority. Beyond staff management, the butler orchestrated the ritual of dining, the grand performance that showcased the household's refinement. He oversaw table settings, ensuring the layout followed the meticulous etiquette of the Georgian era. He supervised the footmen during service, guided the sequence of dishes, decanted wines, and monitored the conversation flow to anticipate the family's needs before they even formed the thought. A butler could sense an empty wine glass from across the room, a sixth sense honed through years of experience. He also managed the wine cellar, a subterranean wonderland filled with barrels, bottles, casks, and mysteries. The cellar demanded expertise. Wine needed to be stored at precise temperatures, rotated occasionally, and protected from light, vibration, and rats who evidently had sophisticated taste. The butler kept written inventories with detailed notes about vintage, quantity, and quality. He knew which bottles to serve for special occasions and which to hide when the family's eccentric uncle visited. His duties also extended into the world of correspondence, receiving messages, welcoming guests, announcing arrivals, and presenting callers with the composed efficiency of someone who lived exclusively on dignity and well-polished shoes. The butler opened the front door only with the right amount of ceremony, no more, no less. It was an art form. Despite all these responsibilities, the butler existed within a delicate social tightrope. To the family, he was a trusted figure, respected, necessary, and often privy to personal details. But he was still a servant. His loyalty had to be flawless, his discretion near absolute, and his personal opinions eternally suppressed. He walked the line between visibility and invisibility with masterful balance. What made a butler exceptional wasn't just his ability to maintain order, but his ability to do it without showing strain. Fires burned, disputes erupted, children threw tantrums, guests arrived unannounced, and the butler remained serenely unmoved. If the household descended into chaos, he simply adjusted, reorganized, reassigned, and restored tranquility before the family could register anything had gone wrong. The truth was simple. A Georgian butler didn't just manage a household, he embodied it. His steadiness reflected its stability, his precision reflected its sophistication, his calm reflected its dignity, and the household, whether it realized it or not, relied on him more than on anyone else below stairs. If the butler was the calm, unshakable force that kept the household running in dignified silence, then the housekeeper was the equally formidable counterpart, efficient, respected, and armed with a set of keys so powerful they might as well have been royal insignia. She didn't need jewels. Her power came from knowing where every key was. In the hierarchy of below-stairs life, the housekeeper reigned over her domain with precision and quiet authority. She commanded the female servants, protected the household's deepest domestic secrets, managed supplies with arithmetic wizardry, and maintained the kind of order that could make chaos itself apologize. If the household was a complex organism, the housekeeper was its central nervous system, sensing disturbances, adjusting operations, and keeping everything functioning smoothly. Her base of operations was the housekeeper's room, a sanctuary of calm paperwork and neatly arranged tools of domestic administration. Ledgers lined her desk, samples of fabric, lace, and thread-filled drawers. Shelves held jars of starch, beeswax, and polish. And hanging prominently beside her chair was the ultimate symbol of her rank, the great keyring. Every important lock in the house, linen closets, storerooms, cleaning supplies, delicate objects, belonged to her oversight. She guarded them not with paranoia, but with stewardship. Her keys represented trust, responsibility, and the running heartbeat of household maintenance. The housekeeper's primary duty was managing the linen, a task that might sound mild until you realize just how much fabric a Georgian household consumed. Tablecloths, napkins, servants' aprons, guest sheets, embroidered pillowcases, blankets, towels, curtains, and delicate laces. All of it flowed through the housekeeper's inventory. She knew how many pieces the household owned, where each piece lived, which were showing wear, which needed mending, which needed replacing, and whether any had mysteriously vanished, a crime she would investigate with detective-level scrutiny. Her linen closet was a marvel of organization, stacks arranged by size, season, fabric, and use. Each was folded with geometric precision, smelling faintly of lavender and discipline. Woe to the servant who replaced an item incorrectly. An entire day could be disrupted by a misplaced napkin. Beyond fabric, she oversaw the household budget, and not just casually. She tracked every expenditure with the vigilance of a modern accountant. Candles, coal, soap, starch, brushes, brooms, oils, vinegar, spices, thread, needles, polish, and the countless perishables required to keep a Georgian house functional. She recorded their purchases in neat columns. She made sure supplies were stocked but not wasted, luxurious but not extravagant, functional but never cheap enough to embarrass the family. This budget mastery meant the mistress relied heavily on her. The family's public elegance depended on the housekeeper's private calculations. How much flour was used this week? Why are we going through candles so quickly? Is it time to reorder starch? How does the wine cellar inventory compare to last month's dinners? The housekeeper tracked patterns, prevented shortages, and avoided the kind of embarrassing household mishaps that gentry considered nearly apocalyptic. She also vetted vendors. Butchers, grocers, laundress, and specialty traders visited regularly, and the housekeeper assessed them with hawk-like attention. Anyone trying to cheat the household with low-quality goods, inflated prices, or suspicious waits would find themselves dismissed politely, but permanently. Just as important as supplies was staff management. While the butler commanded the male servants, the housekeeper supervised the female staff. She trained new maids, addressed mistakes, assigned duties, and maintained morale with a balance of firmness and fairness. She understood the inner workings of the servants' hall, which maid needed encouragement, who was struggling, who was prone to carelessness, and who was ready for promotion. She did not micromanage, but she absolutely did not tolerate disorder. Her influence extended to hiring, often acting as the household's trusted advisor when selecting new maids. She interviewed candidates with the same scrutiny she applied to linen, searching for honesty, strength, discretion, and the ability to fold a sheet without starting a small war. A good housekeeper could spot a promising servant in seconds. A bad one could ruin a household's stability. And although she was stern, her motivations were rarely selfish. She championed the welfare of the women under her supervision. If someone fell ill, she noticed. If someone struggled, she adjusted. If someone misbehaved, she corrected. Leadership required balance, and the housekeeper achieved it with a quiet dignity that radiated through the lower ranks. Her authority also extended to household cleanliness, though she did not scrub floors herself. Instead, she performed the inspections, those feared legendary inspections where one glance could reveal a missed cobweb, a dusty corner, or a carelessly placed cushion. Servants dreaded the moment she lifted her finger and traced a line across a surface. A clean fingertip meant relief. A dusty fingertip meant trouble. And though the housekeeper appeared composed, she was constantly aware of timing, order, and the delicate choreography of daily life. Rooms had to be ready before the family rose. Tea trays had to appear the moment they were desired. Fires had to be lit before the temperature offended anyone important. Flowers needed arranging, guest chambers needed perfection, and every event, large or small, flowed under her unseen guidance. Yet her power came with a peculiar social position. She sat at the top of the female servant hierarchy, but she was still a servant, expected to fade into the background when the family was present. She lived in comfortable but modest quarters. Her salary was respectable but not extravagant. She occupied a life of perpetual responsibility, little recognition, and enormous influence. But among the servants she was respected, sometimes feared, often admired, always obeyed. She was the iron backbone of the household, the quiet strategist, the keeper of order and linen, and everything that made the house appear effortlessly refined. In a world where social standing defined every moment, the housekeeper carved her throne not with jewels or titles, but with ledgers, keys, and the unwavering power of competence. When people imagine Georgian servants, they often picture the uniforms, the bustling routines, the grand houses humming with activity, but rarely do they picture the coin purses. Which is fair, because the coin purses were rarely full. The pay was low, but at least the work was exhausting. Servant wages were a peculiar blend of practicality, inequality, and quiet resignation. They varied wildly depending on rank, skill, reputation, and the size of the household. A grand estate might employ 24 servants, a modest townhouse perhaps 6. But no matter the scale, the laws of Georgian economics applied universally. The higher the expectations, the smaller the paycheck seemed to feel. Let's begin with the basics. A servant's income came in the form of annual wages, usually paid in 2 installments, sometimes only 1, because employers like to prolong the suspense. If a servant misbehaved, wages could be docked. If a servant excelled, wages remained predictably ordinary. And while some positions earned more than others, even the best paid servants rarely enjoyed financial comfort. The butler and the housekeeper, leaders of their respective realms, earned the highest salaries below stairs. Their pay reflected responsibility. The butler managed valuables and order. The housekeeper managed linen, budgeting, and the entire female staff. Their combined authority kept the household running with an almost military structure. Their wages were respectable, but still not enough to retire on unless they planned to retire in a very small shed. Below them, footmen earned surprisingly higher wages than many housemaids, despite often having fewer technical skills. Why? Because appearance mattered, and households essentially paid for height, good posture, and the ability to look decorative while not breaking the china. Meanwhile, the maids who scrubbed, boiled, carried, polished, bleached, and obeyed often earned far less, an imbalance that made perfect sense to absolutely no one except Georgian society. At the bottom of the wage ladder were the hall boys and scullery maids, who performed the most grueling tasks for the smallest sums. Their work hours stretched like taffy, and their exhaustion was legendary, but their wages remained stubbornly modest, as if the household believed unskilled suffering should be its own reward. But here's the twist. Wages were only part of the economic equation. Servants also received room and board, meaning they lived in the house rent-free and were fed daily. Fed is a generous term, they ate, but not always delightfully. Still, in an era where food insecurity was real, a guaranteed meal, however unappetizing, was a lifeline. Their lodging might be cramped, cold, and shaped suspiciously like a storage cupboard, but it was included in the job. Then came the perks, known delightfully as perquisites or perks for short. These were small but invaluable allowances that softened the realities of pitiful pay. Perks varied depending on the household, but often included cast-off clothing from the family, highly prized even if several trends out of date, drippings from roasts, used in cooking and spread on bread, making a kind of buttery miracle for poorer servants. Tea leaves already used by the family, because recycling wasn't invented in the modern era. It was invented by necessity. Small coins from guests, often slipped to footmen or maids during travel or events. Leftover candles, which could be sold or repurposed for personal use. Kitchen cerises, which provided extra nourishment or occasionally extra confusion. Perks could often make the difference between basic survival and mild comfort. Many servants relied on them heavily, especially in harsh winters when wages stretched thin. But the most important perk wasn't edible, wearable, or burnable. It was patronage. For a servant, patronage was the subtle art of cultivating goodwill with employers. If a master or mistress admired a servant's loyalty, skill, or discretion, they might offer generous Christmas boxes, financial help, assistance in finding future employment, or even long-term security done through recommendations and pensions. A good reference from a respected household could raise a servant's market value instantly. Patronage was the closest thing to job insurance a Georgian servant could hope for. The Christmas box tradition was especially beloved. Once a year, usually on St. Stephen's Day, servants received boxes containing coins, leftover holiday fare, used but fancy garments, or other appreciated tokens. For many, this was the closest thing to a bonus, and it helped offset the low wages of the rest of the year. Some servants saved their Christmas money carefully. Others spent it immediately on necessities, small luxuries, or treating themselves to the rare feeling of independence. Despite all these perks, servants rarely accumulated real wealth. Most sent money home to help family members. Some saved tiny amounts in hopes of eventually marrying or opening a small shop. But wages alone didn't allow for much dreaming. The system kept them comfortable enough to stay, uncomfortable enough to keep working, and dependent enough to maintain loyalty. One overlooked aspect of servant pay was the role of seniority. While promotions existed, they were slow, rare, and often contingent on vacancies rather than merit. A maid of all work might spend years hoping to rise to upper housemaid. A promising footman might wait a decade for a chance at the butler's role. Ambition existed, but it had to contend with hierarchy, tradition, and the occasional charismatic rival who also wanted the nicer room. And yet many servants found pride in their positions. Wages may have been small, but status within the servant community was priceless. A respected servant earned trust, camaraderie, and a sense of belonging. And while pay barely reflected the labour, the shared experience of life below stairs often formed bonds stronger than money. In the end, the economics of Georgian service were simple and brutal. Servants were expected to give everything, time, energy, skills, privacy, in exchange for modest wages and the chance to stay fed and sheltered. But within that harsh framework lay a network of small mercies, practical perks, and the quiet knowledge that each servant's efforts kept the grand household functioning. For Georgian servants, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was identity, hierarchy, acceptation, and a daily reminder that no matter how exhausted you were, you still needed to look presentable enough to avoid scandal. Servants didn't have wardrobes bursting with options. In most households you had two outfits, work clothes and slightly cleaner work clothes. Let's begin with the female servants, whose attire had to balance functionality, modesty, and an unspoken rule. You should blend into the background so well that guests barely noticed you existed, and if they did, it should be because your appearance reflected well on the household. A maid's basic uniform consisted of a simple dress made from sturdy, washable fabric, usually dark wool or cotton, chosen specifically because it hid stains, dirt, soot, and the few remaining fragments of hope. Over this went an apron, often white, that acted as both a protective layer and a prison sentence, since keeping it clean was a full-time job. The apron had to be spotless during meals, moderately tidy during chores, and only allowed to look disastrous when no one important was watching. Then there was the cap, the iconic symbol of a maid's position. Caps were not optional. They signalled discipline, cleanliness, and the housekeeper's iron will. Some were frilled, some starched, some simple, and all had the uncanny ability to slip off at the worst possible moment. Maids wore their caps daily, ensuring they stayed on even when sprinting upstairs, bending over fires, or dodging footmen. Losing your cap was embarrassing. Wringing sweat or soot out of it was inevitable. Laundry was a central part of the clothing struggle. Every garment a servant owned had to withstand relentless washing, boiling, scrubbing, and wringing. Delicate fabrics were a luxury reserved for upstairs. Down below, everything was expected to survive repeated encounters with lye soap, which was so harsh it could probably remove paint from a carriage and still look presentable. And this meant clothing aged fast. Seams frayed, colours faded, fabric thinned until a particularly sharp stare might puncture it. Servants often mended their own clothes late at night, sewing patches discreetly, and repairing hems that caught on furniture or betrayed their exhaustion. For male servants, especially footmen, clothing served a very different function. Their livery wasn't designed for practicality, but for spectacle. Georgian households treated livery as a public announcement. Look how wealthy we are. Even our servants dress better than some aristocrats. A footman's uniform usually included a bright coat, often in the family's chosen colours, breeches, waistcoat, white stockings, polished shoes, and a powdered wig or neatly powdered hair. The more elaborate the embroidery, the richer the household. Some families spent more on a footman's livery than the footman earned in wages in an entire year. Footmen polished their buttons, buckles and shoes daily, till they shone like they were auditioning for a Sunlight commercial. They had to keep their coats spotless, their stockings impossibly white, and their movements precise, because nothing ruined aristocratic elegance faster than a footman with a wrinkled sleeve. Of course, servants also wore workwear, clothing intended solely for dirty tasks, cleaning hearths, hauling coal, scrubbing floors, or working in the scullery. These garments were usually older, more battered versions of their regular attire. Workwear was faded, stained, patched and functional. No one expected it to look good. They only expected it to survive. But even workwear followed rules. It had to be modest, intact, and appropriate to the servant's rank. A maid couldn't wear anything too fine while doing rough work. It would signal pretension. A footman couldn't appear ragged outside of his livery. It would reflect poorly on the household. Servants were constantly balancing personal comfort with professional expectations. The real magic trick of servant clothing, however, was maintaining it despite the realities of daily labour. Servants sweated, scrubbed, ran, crouched, carried, polished, shivered in winter, and sweltered in summer. And yet their clothing had to remain clean enough to pass the housekeeper's inspections. The housekeeper became the unofficial clothing critic of below stairs. She inspected aprons, checked hems, noted stains, and ensured that every servant appeared neat enough to represent the household, even if that servant had just finished pulling ashes out of a fireplace. Another clothing-related challenge was second-hand garments from the family. When the lady of the house discarded dresses, servants might receive them after modifications, but these dresses were rarely suited for heavy labour and had to be altered drastically. Similarly, cast-off waistcoats or coats from the master sometimes found their way to male servants, though these often arrived in colours or sizes that posed unique tailoring problems. Servants sometimes supplemented their wardrobe through small personal purchases, usually from itinerant traders selling threadbare clothing at bargain prices. Every servant knew how to bargain. Every servant also knew how to sew. A servant who couldn't mend was either new or in deep trouble. Still, clothing served an important psychological purpose. It reinforced identity. The butler's black coat symbolised authority. The housekeeper's tidy dress and keychain signalled respect. The footman's livery announced prestige. The maid's cap and apron indicated order and reliability. Even the scullery maid's shabby work gown revealed her place in the hierarchy. Looking presentable wasn't just vanity, it was proof of discipline, training and pride, even under miserable conditions. And yet, beneath every clean apron, every polished button, and every perfectly starched cap was a servant who knew that maintaining their clothing required just as much effort as their actual job. They wore their uniforms like armour, facing the day not with swords or shields, but with neatly folded fabric and the determination to look respectable while doing work that resisted dignity entirely. If you asked a Georgian servant what mealtime was like, they might laugh first, answer second, and cry later, because while food was provided, the experience hovered somewhere between practicality, improvisation, and culinary roulette. The good news? You get fed. The bad news? It's whatever the family rejected in fear, boredom, or confusion. Unlike the elaborate performances happening upstairs, multi-course spreads, ornamental dishes, fine wines, sauces with names longer than most servants' pay cycles, meals below stairs were simpler, faster, and dictated entirely by the household's leftovers. Servants did not choose the menu. They merely hoped it didn't fight back. Breakfast below stairs, the early morning fueling station. Servants were almost always awake before dawn, and a breakfast reflected their schedule. Quick, plain, and eaten with the kind of urgency seen only in people who know they'll be running for the next 16 hours. Breakfast usually consisted of porridge or gruel, bread, provable with imagination, occasionally cheese or dripping, fat skimmed from roasted meats. Tea, if the household was generous, or if the servants secretly reused leaves already thrown away upstairs. This meal happened standing up mid-task, or in a brief moment of organised chaos. No one lingered. Lingering was a luxury reserved for people who didn't have 12 fireplaces to prepare. Dinner for the staff, a carefully timed affair. Dinner in Georgian England, the main meal of the day, was served to the family in the early afternoon, but reached the servants at a different time entirely. Once the upstairs service was complete, the leftovers made their descent. But leftovers weren't guaranteed. They were a privilege determined by the size of the household. What guests had eaten. The cook's mood. Whether the family had changed their mind and sampled dishes twice. Servants rarely sat down to eat until the upstairs plates had been cleared, scraped, and examined by the butler or cook. Only then were the remains declared fit for servants, which was a generous interpretation of still edible. Leftovers included roasted meats shaved to their most optimistic edges, vegetables that had lost the will to live, soups cooled to a temperature best described as philosophical, pies with the interesting fillings removed, bread rolls hardened to the density of masonry tools. When there were leftovers worth celebrating, the footmen or trusted staff were allowed first pick. Rank determined everything, even at mealtime. The cook also claimed certain parts of dishes routinely, either for her private stash, her preferred servants, or what she considered her rightful spoils of war. The servants' hall, eating with order and hierarchy. Meals happened in the servants' hall, a long plain room with wooden tables, benches, and an atmosphere of communal exhaustion. Even here, hierarchy reigned. Seating wasn't random. The butler sat at the head of the table, the housekeeper at the opposite end, the higher servants, next junior servants at the sides, hall boys and scullery maids squeezed wherever space and fate allowed. Conversation was polite but minimal. Everyone was too tired for small talk and too hungry to waste energy on it. If anyone laughed too loudly or dropped a utensil, several heads turned, not out of annoyance, but out of shock that someone had enough strength left for noise. Suppers and snacks, rare but cherished, Bunwoody meals were even more unpredictable. Supper might consist of cold leftovers, bread dipped in gravy, or whatever could be scavenged from the kitchen once the cook was done shouting for the evening. If a household had hosted guests, there might be enough scraps for a decent meal. If the guests were unusually hungry or joyful, servants sometimes ended up chewing bread and making peace with disappointment. Snacks also existed, but only in the sense that a servant found a crust someone abandoned, a cook permitted the licking of spoons, a kitchen maid smuggled out a bruised apple, a miracle occurred. Food was fuel, not pleasure. Nobody below stairs ate for fun, they ate so they could survive until the next meal without collapsing onto a staircase. Strict rules shaped every bite. Servants did not eat when they wanted. They ate when the household allowed it. Mealtimes were structured around the family's schedule, the kitchen's rhythm, and the cook's directive. Certain rules shaped the ritual. No eating upstairs, ever, unless carrying food for the family. No servant dared bring a crumb across the threshold of upstairs respectability. No eating while serving. If the family needed something mid-meal, servants paused their own food instantly. A cold meal was better than a scolding. Do not take food without permission. Kitchens were tempting, but theft, real or perceived, could end a career. Even nibbling on a carrot could spark a scandal. Do not complain about the food. Complaints meant ungratefulness, and ungratefulness meant someone would find themselves peeling potatoes for 2 extra hours. Food as status and survival. The interesting paradox was that despite the frugality of their meals, servants often ate better than many poor labourers of the era, simply because they had access to meat scraps, broth remnants, bones, cooked vegetables, and pantry leftovers. It wasn't elegant, but it was food. Christmas and holidays brought rare extravagance. The servants' hall might receive a goose, a pudding, or special pastries. For one glorious day they tasted the upstairs world, although slightly colder and with fewer decorative flourishes, eating together, the only true pause in the day. Despite the rules, hierarchy, and unpredictable menus, mealtime below stairs carried something priceless, a moment of shared humanity. For a few minutes, all the servants, from the butler to the scullery maid, came together as equals in exhaustion, hunger, and the small warmth that came from eating in company. Meals below stairs weren't luxurious, but they were grounding. They kept bodies moving, spirits surviving, and the household functioning. If the grand Georgian house above stairs dazzled with glittering chandeliers, velvet drapery, and craftsmanship so ornate it made guests gasp, the servants' quarters below stairs told a very different story, one of creaking boards, cramped spaces, and furniture chosen not for elegance, but for its ability to barely function. Your bed was comfortable, if your definition of comfortable was doesn't actively stab you. Servants' bedrooms were tucked into the least glamorous corners of the estate. The attic, the basement, the far ends of drafty corridors, or anywhere builders could wedge a mattress without alarming the architect. Comfort was not the goal, efficiency was. If a space could fit a servant and allow them to wake up without accidentally suffocating, it counted as a success. Most servants slept in shared rooms, arranged according to rank and gender. Privacy was a myth, one spoken of wistfully, like unicorns or full nights of sleep. 2, 3, or even 4 servants shared the same chamber, with beds placed so close that turning over required coordination. The only people who enjoyed single rooms were the butler, the housekeeper, and occasionally the lady's maid or valet. Even then, their rooms were modest by any standard, small, practical, and shaped with the architectural creativity of a narrow broom cupboard. Female servants usually slept near the top floors, close to the family bedrooms, so they could respond instantly to nighttime bells, sick children, or the occasional request for warm milk at 1 a.m. Male servants, especially footmen, slept closer to the main floors or near the entrance so they could handle late-night guests, secure doors, and prevent aristocrats from accidentally wandering into the wrong room. The rooms themselves were bare-bones minimalism before minimalism was fashionable. Walls were plain plaster, sometimes cracked, often cold. Floors were wooden boards with gaps wide enough to whistle when the wind blew. Windows, if present, were small and draughty, offering scenic views of chimneys or brick walls. A single candle or oil lamp served as the only source of light, and when the flame flickered, the room resembled a haunted storage closet. Furniture was functional, not attractive. A typical servant's room contained a narrow bed with a lumpy mattress made of straw, wool, or something the maid sincerely hoped was wool, a thin blanket that provided moral support more than actual warmth, a wooden chest or box for storing the entirety of one's belongings, a basin and pitcher for washing, luxuries shared between roommates. The faint hope that the room would not leak during storms. The bed was the centrepiece, though calling it a centrepiece implies beauty it did not possess. Mattresses were uneven, prone to sagging, and filled with the kind of mysterious lumps one learned not to investigate. Springs hadn't been invented yet, so the support system relied on ropes that had to be periodically tightened. If the ropes loosened, the bed sagged. If the mattress shifted, you rolled into your roommate. And if you were unlucky enough to draw the oldest bed in the house, you'd spend each night negotiating terms with gravity. Despite these discomforts, servants treasured their beds. After days filled with running, lifting, bending, cleaning, cooking, polishing, and being generally overworked, any horizontal surface felt like luxury. Ventilation, however, was the enemy. Servants' quarters could be stuffy, smoky, cold, or all three at once. In winter, attic rooms transformed into miniature versions of the Arctic. In summer, they trapped heat like ovens. Breathable air was optional. Breezes were miracles. And since servants rarely had time to air out their bedding, the overall scent of a servant's hallway was a combination of sweat, soap, damp linens, and dreams of freedom. Of course, the greatest challenge in these rooms was the lack of privacy. Servants dressed in the company of others, whispered gossip under blankets, and tried to rest while roommates snored, coughed, or muttered work instructions in their sleep. Personal space consisted of the 2 square feet directly above and below your body. And yet these cramped quarters sometimes became the one place where servants built community. They whispered secrets after curfew, shared stories of their homes, comforted each other during illnesses, and forged friendships stronger than the thin walls between rooms. After hours of formality, invisibility, and relentless work, the servants' rooms offered something the grand halls above never could, a moment of authenticity. Senior servants' rooms were slightly better, but only slightly. The housekeeper, for example, enjoyed the luxury of a writing desk, a sturdy chair, and a bed large enough to stretch out without bumping into a wall. The butler's room might contain shelves for record-keeping, extra keys, or the occasional bottle of decent wine. But even these privileged rooms existed in narrow spaces and carried the same draftiness shared by the entire staff. Another curious aspect of servant bedrooms was noise. Every house made its own set of sounds: creaking stairs, rattling pipes, distant bells, the kitchen hearth settling, footmen hustling past, or mice hosting late-night social gatherings. Servants learned to sleep through everything or risk never sleeping at all. Yet despite these hardships, the quarters held immense emotional value. It was the place servants retreated to after days of being perfectly polite, perfectly silent, perfectly efficient, and perfectly invisible. In these cramped little rooms, they could finally exhale. They could talk, joke, cry, vent, and exist as people rather than functionaries. Here, the lumpy bed wasn't a throne, but it was a personal refuge. The chest with belongings wasn't grand, but it contained treasures: a ribbon, a letter from home, a scrap of lace, a book passed down through several hands. These rooms, however small, held their past and their future. So while the servants' quarters were narrow, cold, uncomfortable, and occasionally questionable in hygiene, they represented something essential, the only space in the household where servants could briefly stop performing. And sometimes that was more valuable than comfort. If the elegant rooms upstairs hosted quiet conversations about politics, poetry, and polite boredom, the world below stairs hosted something far more vibrant: gossip, drama, alliances, rivalries, and the occasional romance that absolutely everyone knew about except the two people involved. Below stairs, gossip travelled faster than the footmen, and they ran. Life in service was intense. Long hours, cramped quarters, strict rules, and constant proximity to the same people day after day. That combination created an atmosphere where small slights became dramatic epics, whispered rumours gained legendary status, and friendships formed with the ferocity of people who needed each other to survive the madness, the social microclimate below stairs. Although servants worked endlessly, they still found moments to talk in corridors, while polishing, during late-night chores, and especially in the servants' hall. Here, the household's unofficial newspaper thrived. News included who was in trouble with the housekeeper, which maid had cried in the scullery last night, which footman nearly sebid during dinner service, which guest had requested something absurd, which upstairs conversation had been overheard from behind a door. Servants overheard everything: arguments, flirtations, critiques of fashion choices, financial anxieties, and the kind of scandals aristocrats assumed servants were too invisible to notice. Spoiler, they noticed. They just pretended not to, then repeated details later with expert commentary. But gossip wasn't merely entertainment. It was currency, a survival tool. Knowing who liked whom, who disliked whom, who was angling for promotion, or who was on the edge of being dismissed, helped servants navigate the household's shifting politics. Alliances and quiet support systems. Living and working in such close quarters meant alliances naturally formed. Maids often bonded over shared chores. Footmen developed camaraderie through shared humiliation and polishing sessions. Kitchen staff united against the cook's volcanic moods. Senior servants formed diplomatic teams to maintain order. These alliances weren't formal, but they were essential. People protected those they trusted. They shared information, covered each other's mistakes, swapped shifts, and occasionally smuggled food to someone who had missed a meal while running errands upstairs. Sometimes alliances formed between people who barely spoke, two servants exchanging meaningful glances over the endless chaos. Sometimes alliances became surrogate families, and sometimes alliances dissolved instantly over something trivial: a borrowed apron not returned, a favourite spoon misplaced, a footman's smile interpreted as flirtation by the wrong person. Below stairs, friendships were intense because everything else was intense. A servant who dried your tears after a scolding could become your closest friend. Someone who criticised your folding technique might instantly become your nemesis. Rivalries and competition. With clear hierarchies and limited opportunities for advancement, rivalries were inevitable. Housemaids competed for the housekeeper's approval, footmen competed for the family's attention and for the higher wages that came with seniority. Kitchen maids competed for the cook's rare praise. Even hall boys competed not to be the one blamed for whatever went wrong last. Rivalries below stairs weren't always hostile. Some were more like motivational duels, but others simmered. A maid might resent another for receiving better assignments. A footman might brood over another's superior posture. The butler might pit servants against one another unintentionally simply by complimenting someone's speed or efficiency. And of course, jealousy could turn small disagreements into full-scale melodrama. If a servant suspected someone else of currying favour with the family, or worse, being recommended for a position elsewhere, the gossip mill accelerated instantly. Forbidden and complicated romances. Wherever young people live together, romance follows. In Georgian households, it arrived with dramatic flair and plenty of consequences. Young male and female servants worked side by side for hours, shared gossip, carried burdens together, and occasionally caught each other's eyes in the servants' hall. Courtship rituals were subtle. A footman carrying coal for a maid patching a footman's torn sleeve. Two servants exchanging smiles during evening duties. Someone offering the last piece of leftover bread, the 18th century equivalent of a love poem. But relationships were risky. Many households explicitly forbade servant romances, worrying that emotional distractions would ruin discipline. Secret meetings became common, whispered conversations on back staircases, lingering glances across the kitchen, late-night exchanges of letters hidden beneath plates. If a romance became known, reactions varied. Some housekeepers ignored harmless flirting. Some butlers quietly hoped relationships would keep morale stable. Some employers forbade everything and dismissed servants at the first sign of impropriety. Romance could be thrilling, but it was also dangerous. Pregnancy outside marriage was catastrophic. A servant couple might be forced to leave, marry quickly, or find work elsewhere. Fear didn't stop relationships, it just made them more dramatic. Tension and emotional pressure. Servants lived under constant scrutiny. Mistakes weren't private, they were instantly known, discussed and analysed. Emotional strain was shared communally. A bad day for one servant often became a tense day for all. Sometimes drama erupted spectacularly. Two servants arguing in the corridor, a maid bursting into tears after a harsh reprimand, a footman slamming a cupboard door with slightly too much force, a kitchen maid snapping at the cook, a dangerous sport. These moments spread quickly through the hall like wildfire, yet the same environment that created tension also fostered extraordinary resilience. Forgiveness came quickly, humour softened wounds, complaints became shared jokes, and servants learned to survive together in a world that demanded everything from them, while giving very little in return. The heartbeat of below-stairs culture, despite the rules, the hierarchy, and the endless work, though below-stairs was not a bleak place. It was lively, full of characters, full of stories. Servants laughed, teased, conspired, dreamed, and occasionally fell into dramatic feuds worthy of a theatrical stage. The gossip wasn't just noise, it was narrative. The drama wasn't just conflict, it was the shared heartbeat of a community that had to create its own joy in the cracks of an exhausting life. Below stairs, life was chaotic, emotional, unpredictable, and profoundly human. Working below stairs in a Georgian household meant living inside a rulebook so detailed it could rival a legal code, and twice as unforgiving. Discipline wasn't optional, it was oxygen. The household ran on silence, obedience, timing, and the careful choreography of people who had learned that breaking rules was simple. Breathe too loudly. Servants lived under layers of expectations, some written, some spoken, some passed down through generations of staff who whispered warnings like folklore. A Georgian home didn't function on charm or improvisation, it functioned on discipline, and discipline came with consequences. The household rulebook, a manual of don'ts. Some large estates actually maintained formal household manuals. laying out everything from the correct way to fold a napkin to the order in which lamps should be extinguished. Most houses, however, relied on traditions reinforced by the butler and housekeeper, two walking rule books with impeccable posture. Rules covered every imaginable situation. Never address the family unless addressed first. Never be seen idling. Never contradict the mistress. Never arrive late to a task. Never forget your cap, apron, gloves, or dignity, whichever applied. Never allow a guest to see you looking confused, dishevelled, or alive in the wrong room. There were rules for bells, rules for bowing, rules for handling silver, rules for handling gossip. You don't. Rules for carrying trays, flat, steady, silent. Rules for opening doors, smoothly, quietly, theatrically restrained. Even rules had rules. But perhaps the most universal expectation was silence. Servants were to move like shadows, speak only when necessary, and vanish the moment their task was complete. A servant heard everything but reacted to nothing. If the family argued, servants pretended to be temporarily deaf. If a guest behaved strangely, servants developed sudden tunnel vision. If a child demanded something absurd, servants complied without blinking. Silence was safety. Supervision and watchful eyes. The housekeeper and butler were the guardians of order. Their job wasn't merely to manage work, it was to enforce rules with fairness, sharp observation, and occasionally terrifying calm. The housekeeper monitored the female servant's conduct with hawk-like precision. She noticed wrinkled aprons, improperly arranged bedding, half-hearted polishing, side conversations, a maid who seemed too familiar with a footman. The butler kept similar vigilance over the male staff. He evaluated posture, punctuality, attentiveness, and whether a footman breathed in a manner he considered distracting. Supervision didn't end with them. Senior servants corrected junior ones. Experienced maids corrected new hires. Everyone watched everyone, sometimes out of responsibility, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes because there was nothing else interesting to look at during 12-hour shifts. The result was a constant low-level feeling of being scrutinized. Servants learned to self-correct before anyone else could correct them. Penalties, from subtle to severe. Breaking a rule wasn't trivial. Punishments ranged from humiliating to career-ending. Minor offences, a dusty banister, a crooked napkin, a missed cobweb, might earn a stern lecture, extra chores, a pointed remark during mealtime that echoed in your soul. More serious offences, talking back, lateness, inappropriate behaviour, mishandling valuables, could lead to fines deducted from already meagre wages, loss of perquisites, being assigned miserable tasks for several days, a cold, disapproving silence from the housekeeper, the worst of all fates. And then came the ultimate punishment, dismissal. To be fired without a reference was social death. Without a reference, no one would hire you. Without employment, you lost your home. Servants understood this intimately, and worked with a kind of disciplined fear that kept mistakes rare, or at least invisible. Dismissal didn't always result from scandal. Sometimes one wrong moment, breaking a prized vase, misplacing a key, dropping a dish in front of important guests, could end a career even if the servant had worked flawlessly for years. Curfews and controlled lives. Servants did not own their time. They were expected to be in bed early enough to function at dawn and awake early enough to serve the household before it stirred. Curfew wasn't a dramatic bell toll. It was the housekeeper's stern expectation that after evening duties, maids retire immediately, no dawdling. Men's movements were also regulated. Footmen couldn't wander the halls at odd hours. Hall boys couldn't loiter near the kitchen. Young servants could not be caught meeting in shadowy corners, because nothing panicked an employer more than the possibility of romance blooming in the wallpaper. Free time was brief, monitored, and fragile. The idea of leisure existed only as a whispered rumour. The art of not getting fired. Surviving Georgian service required a very specific skill set. Move silently, work constantly, appear cheerful but not too cheerful. No one trusts excessive enthusiasm. Learn to read the housekeeper's footsteps like a weather forecast, know when to disappear. Know when to reappear. Master the ability to hold a tray while contemplating existential despair. Be humble, obedient, and blessed with the ability to predict disasters before they happened. It also required emotional intelligence. Servants learned to sense tensions in the family, anticipate needs, and prevent small problems from becoming visible. A good servant didn't just follow rules, they anticipated them. Discipline as community survival. Strict rules didn't exist merely to oppress, though they were certainly effective at that. They ensured the household functioned with military precision, preventing chaos from spilling into the family's carefully curated world. They also created unity. Servants understood what was expected. They relied on each other to maintain order. They formed bonds through shared discipline, shared fear, and shared success. When a crisis hit, unexpected guests, broken china, spilled gravy, the staff didn't panic. They fell into formation, each performing their role so flawlessly it resembled instinct rather than duty. Through discipline, they protected not just the household, but each other's livelihoods. Below stairs, survival depended on rules, but so did pride. A well-run household was a servant's accomplishment as much as the family's. Free time below stairs was a strange, delicate creature, rare, skittish, and usually gone before a servant could blink. If the family above enjoyed leisurely breakfasts, long afternoons of idle conversation, and seasonal trips to the countryside, the servants' world operated on a different clock. Free time wasn't free, it was rented out in 5-minute increments. Servants lived in a perpetual loop of duties, bells, cleaning, and anticipation. Their days began early, ended late, and stretched so tightly that leisure had to be squeezed into the cracks like light slipping under a door. And yet, despite the relentless schedule, moments of rest did exist. Tiny, precious pauses that took on mythic significance. The idea of a day off. Let's begin with the most optimistic concept, the fabled day off. In many Georgian households, servants received one afternoon or evening per week, typically reserved for attending church, visiting family, or simply trying to remember what their legs felt like when they weren't climbing stairs. But a full day off was rare, reserved for households so well staffed that losing one servant for 24 hours didn't cause structural collapse. Most servants took their time off strategically. The lady's maid might slip away in the afternoon after her mistress dressed for the day. A footman might take an evening once dinner service ended. A kitchen maid might be granted a late morning if the cook needed less help. But even these breaks came with conditions. If unexpected guests arrived, day off cancelled. If the mistress needed assistance dressing for an event, cancelled. If the housekeeper decided the pantry needed reorganisation, cancelled with organisational enthusiasm. Servants learned not to count on breaks. Hope was fragile. Dust was eternal. How servants actually spent free time. When servants finally escaped their duties, their activities depended on energy, rank, and the ever-watchful eyes of senior staff. Some walked outside, relishing fresh air like it was a luxury commodity. Others wrote letters home, painstakingly crafted, often the only connection to families they rarely saw. A few read books, if they owned any, sang quietly or mended clothing. For many servants, free time meant chatting in the servants' hall, sharing gossip, because gossip was the unofficial staff hobby, resting aching feet, taking a rare nap, enjoying a cup of tea, uninterrupted by someone shouting their name. These small activities mattered. They didn't restore energy so much as stabilize the soul. Sundays, the almost day off. Sundays were special not because work stopped, because it didn't, but because social expectations shifted slightly. Many servants attended church, partly out of faith, partly out of obligation, partly because church was the only public place where servants felt like citizens, rather than household machinery. It was a chance to see friends from neighbouring estates, exchange news, compare workloads, admire or envy others' clothing. Valuate potential romantic candidates. Enjoy 60-90 minutes of sitting still. Church was not rest, but it was a sanctioned break from the household, a mental exhale in an otherwise relentless environment. After church, servants rushed back to resume duties, but the short absence made a world of difference. Being outside, even briefly, reminded them the world existed beyond polishing silver and boiling laundry. Seasonal joy, Christmas boxes and holiday traditions. Among all holidays, Christmas was the crown jewel of servant happiness. Not because work decreased, if anything, it increased, but because Christmas came with traditions that recognized servants' labour. The most beloved was the Christmas box. This was a gift given by the family, usually on Boxing Day, St. Stephen's Day, containing coins, small but precious. Food leftovers from the holiday feast. Cast-off clothing. Sweets or pastries, practical items like stockings or ribbons. Sometimes a personal note of thanks. The Christmas box wasn't mere charity. It was a morale booster. Servants saved up their Christmas money, using it to buy necessities, treat themselves or send funds home. It was the rare moment when their service was publicly acknowledged. Holiday meals below stairs were also richer. The cook, if generous, prepared something special, a goose pudding or extra-large pastries. Even the scullery maid might get a hearty slice of something warm and celebratory. These festive meals created shared joy, rare moments when exhaustion softened under laughter. Festivals, fairs and escapes. On the rarest occasions, servants managed to attend local fairs or village festivals. These outings required negotiation with the housekeeper and strategic planning around the family's schedule. But when allowed, they were glorious. Dancing music market stalls, sweet treats, performers' games, opportunities for flirtation. Servants returned from fairs with stories, trinkets, and enough joy to survive several more weeks of relentless labour. The psychological relief of stolen moments. Some of the best leisure wasn't scheduled at all, it was stolen. Servants became experts at finding micro-breaks in their day. A minute leaning against a cool wall, a sip of tea while no bells were ringing, a quiet chat on the back staircase, a deep breath beside an open window, a brief laugh in the corridor before duty called. These were tiny rebellions against exhaustion. They didn't repair the body, but they kept the spirit from breaking. Why? Free time mattered. So much. Below stairs left no room for indulgence, but emotional resilience needed moments of relief. The small pauses reminded servants that they were more than machines. Holidays brought hope. Friendships brought comfort. Breaks, however small, brought humanity back into the relentless cycle of service. Free time wasn't luxury, it was survival. Life below stairs demanded physical endurance, but it demanded something far harder too. Quiet, relentless emotional resilience. Service required patience, composure, obedience, and the ability to swallow frustration so often you practically developed a second stomach for it. If anxiety burned calories, every Georgian servant would float like a feather. Servants lived in a world that expected flawlessness without ever acknowledging the sheer impossibility of the task. Their work was constant. Their movements were monitored. Their mistakes, no matter how trivial, could be catastrophic. And above all, their inner emotions had to remain invisible, tucked away behind polite manners and steady hands. The constant pressure to perform. From the moment a servant woke up, usually before their dreams could finish forming, they entered performance mode. Every action had to be done correctly, quietly, and without hesitation. There was no margin for errors like dropping a plate, forgetting a fire, misplacing a key, serving the wrong dish, arriving 10 seconds late. Even minor slips invited scrutiny, not just from employers but from senior servants who maintained standards with the intensity of military officers. A single mistake didn't just inconvenience the household, it threatened the servant's reputation, wages, and sometimes their job. Servants were always aware that someone was watching. The housekeeper's footsteps could strike dread through an entire hallway. The butler's raised eyebrow could ruin a footman's week. A mistress's frown could make a maid's hand shake for hours. Perfection wasn't requested, it was demanded. Fear of dismissal and the weight of reputation. The threat of being dismissed hung in the air like a permanently charged thundercloud. To be fired without a reference was not simply losing a job, it was losing a home, community, stability, and future employment. Without references, a servant might as well have been invisible to the hiring world. This fear seeped into everything. Servants internalized an unspoken rule: you cannot afford to disappoint anyone. A housemaid might scrub a floor 3 times to avoid being accused of laziness. A footman might polish silver until he could see the precise moment he regretted every life decision. A kitchen maid might triple-check every pot in terror that she'd missed a scorch mark. And beneath this fear lived another quiet burden: guilt. Servants felt guilty for resting, for slowing down, for slipping out to breathe fresh air, for taking a moment to themselves. In households with stern leadership, guilt became second nature, a tool used to maintain order, but one that etched itself deep into the emotional fabric of below-stairs life. Exhaustion that never left. Exhaustion was not a temporary state, it was a lifestyle. The human body is not designed to endure 16-hour days filled with running, lifting, scrubbing, standing, serving, and enduring. Yet servants managed it because they had no choice. Exhaustion expressed itself in subtle ways. Hands trembling after hours of fine-detail work, eyes stinging from lack of sleep, muscles aching in places they didn't know could ache, minds so foggy they ran on instinct rather than awareness. But servants couldn't show exhaustion. If they slowed down, someone noticed. If they yawned, someone commented. If they faltered, someone assumed laziness. There was no space for vulnerability. Even when free time came, small fleeting moments, it rarely repaired the body or mind. Sleep was often shallow, interrupted by bells, drafts, or intrusive thoughts about tasks waiting for them at dawn, the emotional weight of being invisible. In many ways, the emotional toll of service wasn't just about workload. It was about erasure. Servants were expected to be present without being noticed, helpful without being personal, skilled without being praised, knowledgeable without being acknowledged. They navigated the house like ghosts with impeccable posture. They listened to conversations but pretended they didn't. They witnessed private dramas but swallowed them whole. Their opinions were irrelevant, their feelings inconvenient, their presence conditional. Being invisible takes a psychic toll. It eats at one's sense of identity. Servants existed in a strange emotional space. They lived in someone else's home, shared someone else's rhythms, obeyed someone else's expectations, and yet they could never truly belong there. The burnout before. Burnout had a name. What we now call burnout, chronic stress that corrodes well-being, was simply considered part of the job. Servants pushed through physical and mental breaking points because the system offered no alternative. They learned to normalize exhaustion, to mute frustration, to quiet their own needs. Signs of burnout were everywhere. Irritability hidden behind practiced politeness. Emotional numbness mistaken for stoicism. Tears shed silently in stairwells. Sudden outbursts that surprised even the servant. A sinking feeling at dawn that never fully left. And yet many servants persevered with remarkable strength. They developed coping mechanisms, often involving humour, solidarity, and small rebellions like sneaking extra tea or whispering jokes about the absurdity of aristocratic demands. Why they endured. Despite the mental strain, servants found meaning in the pride of mastering difficult tasks, the security of steady wages, however small, the companionship of fellow servants, the satisfaction of running a flawless household, the hope, however slim, of promotional patronage. They endured because they had families to support, ambitions to pursue, or no safer place to go. They endured because community softened hardship, and they endured because resilience was not optional. It was survival. The hidden strength of those below stairs. Behind the perfectly laid tables, polished banisters, and seamless household routines were people carrying emotional burdens few ever saw. Their discipline came at the cost of constant vigilance. Their smiles masked fear. Their silence concealed enormous strength. Below stairs, the emotional toll was real, but so was the courage. Of all the strange dynamics inside a Georgian household, none was more complicated, more delicate, or more emotionally confusing than the daily relationship between servants and their masters. Servants lived inches away from the family, physically close enough to hear them breathe, argue, sneeze, or drop hairpins, yet emotionally distant enough to pretend none of it ever happened. You saw the family more than their own children did, but only one of you was allowed to speak. This relationship was built on loyalty, hierarchy, extreme politeness, and a deep understanding that the line dividing upstairs from downstairs was invisible but electrified. Daily interactions, close enough to touch, distant enough to forget. Servants encountered the family constantly, when lighting fires in the mornings, delivering hot water for washing, arranging rooms, serving meals, handing in letters, collecting laundry, guiding guests, or passing silently in hallways. A servant might see the master in his dressing gown at dawn, the mistress adjusting her hair at noon, and both again at dinner, dressed like royalty. But these moments were governed by rigid behaviour. Servants did not initiate conversation. Servants did not make eye contact unless required. Servants did not comment on anything personal. Servants did not acknowledge overheard remarks, arguments, secrets, or scandals. They were present for the family's most intimate routines, but treated each moment as if it were happening behind glass. A maid might help the mistress into her gown, tying laces close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, yet remain as emotionally invisible as a coat rack. A valet might shave the master's face every morning, steadying his hand near another man's jawline, yet speak only when asked. Familiarity was impossible. Distance was mandatory. Performative politeness, the script everyone knew. The politeness between servants and masters wasn't genuine intimacy. It was a performance both sides understood perfectly. Masters greeted servants with mild warmth or distant acknowledgement. Servants responded with respect so polished it could have been ironed. Even footmen trained in specific ways to hold their bodies, tilt their heads, and modulate their voices when addressing the family. A servant's politeness required emotional gymnastics. Smile, but not too much. Speak clearly, but not at length. Show loyalty, but never presume friendship. Assist with personal tasks, but never imply equality. The interaction resembled professional theatre, scripted, refined, and designed to reinforce who held power. Loyalty as a job requirement. Servants were expected to demonstrate unwavering loyalty, not only in their labour but in their silence. They heard everything, whispered arguments behind doors, financial worries, uttered on staircases, marital tensions, parental failings, medical concerns, and embarrassing social mishaps. Servants were the unseen witnesses to the family's private world, their triumphs, tantrums, tears, and triumphs again. Yet they were forbidden from acknowledging any of it. If a servant overheard a scandal, they tucked it into the vault of things never to be spoken aloud. If a family member confided something by accident, the servant pretended not to notice. If a mistress cried during dressing, a maid might quietly hand her a handkerchief, but the moment passed without words. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. The emotional distance, living near, feeling far. Despite being physically close, servants could not form personal bonds with their employers. They couldn't express frustration, fear, excitement, or sadness. They could not laugh with the family, unless the family initiated it, or reveal their own personalities unless asked. The emotional distance was a protective barrier for both sides. For the family, it preserved authority. For the servants, it prevented vulnerability. Sometimes, however, cracks formed. A kind mistress might show concern for a sick maid. A master might reward a footman's years of service with genuine gratitude. Children often blurred boundaries entirely, treating servants with affection and familiarity until they grew old enough to learn the rules. Many a governess or nursemaid received devotion from children who didn't yet understand that affection and rank were incompatible. But even in these rare closenesses, the line held. Servants knew that too much warmth could create trouble, jealousy, gossip, or the impression of impropriety. The strange intimacy of daily service. Serving someone meant entering the rhythm of their life. A valet learned his master's moods by the way he folded his waistcoat. A lady's maid recognised emotional storms by how tightly her mistress gripped a hairbrush. Servants read facial expressions the way scholars read ancient texts. This closeness created a kind of silent intimacy. The intimacy of knowing someone's habits without ever being allowed to call them a friend. The relationship was paradoxical, tender but formal, familiar but forbidden. When proximity became pressure. This closeness carried emotional strain. Servants absorbed the family's stress, disputes, and expectations without a place to release their own feelings. Imagine dressing a mistress for a ball while she vents about her mother-in-law, then returning downstairs where no one asks how you are doing because you must immediately continue cleaning coal scuttles. Proximity meant never having emotional space. Servants rarely had time to process what they witnessed. They simply carried the weight of their observations quietly and sometimes painfully. And yet, humanity lingered. Despite rigid roles, genuine affection sometimes developed. A master might rely deeply on a trusted valet. A mistress might treat her lady's maid with near-sisterly care. Long-serving housekeepers could become integral to a family's identity. When these bonds formed, they were meaningful but still bound by hierarchy. A servant might be treasured, even valued, but never equal. The unspoken reality, servants and masters lived intertwined lives. One of command, one of service, one of freedom, one of limitations, one of comfort, one of exhaustion. They shared spaces, routines, and daily rhythms, yet occupied entirely different worlds. The relationship was intimate yet distant, warm yet cold, familiar yet formal, a strange and fragile social dance that defined Georgian domestic life for generations. A Georgian household ran on human labour, but it also ran on tools, an entire arsenal of brushes, buckets, scuttles, irons, tongs, cloths and devices that promised to make work easier but more often made servants question the meaning of life. Half the tools didn't work. The other half worked against you. Below stairs, tools were not conveniences, they were necessities, burdens, hazards, and sometimes enemies. Every servant knew them intimately, how to wield them, how to coax them into cooperation, and how to avoid being maimed by them on a busy morning. The bell system, the household's nerve network. Before electricity, before buzzers, before intercoms, there was the bell system, a series of wires and springs running through walls to a panel of dangling bells in the servants' hall. Each bell corresponded to a room upstairs, drawing room, parlour, master's study, mistress's boudoir, guest chambers, dining room, morning room, and so on. To servants, the bell panel was both oracle and torment. The instant a family member pulled a cord upstairs, the matching bell sprang to life below, not just ringing but vibrating so the footman could see which room needed attention. The bells rang all day, signalling requests as varied as bring tea, fetch letters, adjust curtains, retrieve books, replump cushions, apologise for existing. Servants developed sixth senses for bell tones. A sharp ding meant urgency. A timid one meant indecision. A furious rattle meant someone upstairs had run out of patience long before the servant even heard the bell. If multiple bells rang at once, the effect resembled a tiny metallic riot. Fire tools, keeping the house alive without burning it down. Nothing consumed more time or more servants than fires. Georgian homes relied on coal-burning hearths in almost every room, and every hearth required tools that were heavy, sharp, dirty, and occasionally malicious. Servants managed fires with poker, for stirring coals while trying not to inhale enough soot to qualify as a chimney. Tongs, for rearranging burning logs with the precision of a surgeon and the risk of a blacksmith. Shovel, for scooping ash which somehow multiplied overnight like enthusiastic rabbits. Brush, for sweeping dust into piles that instantly turned back into dust clouds. Bellows, for coaxing flames back to life, though sometimes the flames answered with dramatic flair. Firework was part art, part wrestling match. If the fire refused to light, the room froze. If it burned too hot, the wallpaper might blister. And if a servant dropped a coal onto a rug, well, accidents happened, didn't they? Coal scuttles. The eternal burden. Coal scuttles were metal or iron containers used to transport coal from storage rooms to hearths. They were heavy when empty, brutal when full, and catastrophic when a servant tripped carrying one. Every servant who handled coal quickly developed muscles balance. A relationship with soot so intimate they were basically dating. A servant might carry dozens of scuttles a day, up staircases, down narrow corridors and into rooms where carpets cried out for mercy. Even after washing, the scent of coal clung to clothing, hair and hope. Polishers and brushes, the war on dull surfaces. A Georgian household valued shine the way modern households value cleanliness. Anything that could reflect light, silverware, banisters, brass fittings, doorknobs, shoes, mirrors, had to look immaculate. Servants used brass polish that stained fingers for days, leather rubbing cloths to shine tables until you could admire your regrets in them, shoe brushes that required both speed and precision, silver polishers that left behind mysterious smudges if used improperly. Silverware in particular demanded obsession. One fingerprint could undo hours of work. A footman polishing spoons wasn't just cleaning, he was waging a philosophical battle between shine and entropy. Laundry implements, the tools of endless wet suffering. Laundry was its own universe of misery, equipped with tools designed to ensure no servant finished the day with dry hands, dry clothes, or emotional stability. Key implements included washboard, a ridged wooden plank used to scrub stains out of garments, and occasionally the will to live. Copper boiler, a massive tub used to heat water, which took forever to warm and forever to cool. Ringers, primitive devices or hand-twisting techniques that flattened linen and servant dignity simultaneously. Starch buckets, starch-stiffened clothing, but also stiffened fingers, hair, aprons, and anything within a 3-foot radius. Drying racks and lines, often placed in terrible locations like freezing attics or breezy courtyards where nothing dried in time. Laundry days were physically punishing. Boiling water, lifting wet sheets, scrubbing stains. It was a full-body workout before fitness culture existed. Kitchen equipment, weapons of heat and chaos. Though cooks and kitchen maids ruled this domain, their tools affected the entire household. Georgian kitchens featured spits and cranks, used to rotate roasting meats. Some servants spent hours turning cranks like human rotisserie engines. Cauldrons, enormous, steaming pots capable of swallowing smaller servants whole. Cleavers and knives, always sharp, always intimidating, always moving. Mortar and pestles, tools for grinding spices, herbs and occasionally resentment. Pastry boards covered in flour and stress. Kitchen tools were loud, heavy, unpredictable, and often dangerous. But without them, the household starved. Brooms, buckets, and the humble arsenal of cleaning. Not every tool was impressive. Many were basic, cheap, and brutally effective. Straw brooms that shed everywhere. Buckets that always seemed to spring leaks. Cloths worn thin from endless use, scrub brushes capable of removing grime from floors and skin alike. Using these tools wasn't complicated. Using them well, under time pressure, with the housekeeper inspecting your work behind you like a silent hawk, that was skill. The tools that fought back. Every servant had stories about tools that rebelled. A bell that wouldn't stop ringing, a coal scuttle handle snapping mid-staircase, a broom that scattered more dust than it gathered, a laundry tub that overflowed at the worst possible moment, a polishing cloth that smeared instead of shined. If tools were alive, servants suspected, they'd unionize against them. Tools as symbols of service. Despite the frustrations, tools shaped identity. The butler's keys, the housekeeper's ledger and linen press, the footman's polishing cloth, the scullery maid's pot scraper, the laundry maid's wringer, the cook's ladle, held like a sceptre. Each tool represented not just work, but rank, skill, and responsibility. In the grand machine of the Georgian household, tools kept everything running, often imperfectly, often dramatically, but always indispensably. If the daytime routine below stairs was a marathon, the nighttime routine was a stealth mission, silent, exhausting, and carried out at hours even owls find unreasonable. Night shifts meant moving through the house as quietly as ghosts and working as tirelessly as people who knew they'd be up again in just a few hours. Night shifts meant you were awake at hours even owls find unreasonable. Servants didn't get to go off duty the way modern workers do. The Georgian household never fully slept, and neither did its staff. Even when the lamps were low, the hallways quiet, and the family tucked into feather-filled beds, the machinery of service continued to hum in the shadows. The night staff, the unsung workforce. Not every servant stayed awake all night, but enough of them did to keep the house functional, warm and safe until dawn. Common night workers included hall boys, who might as well have been nocturnal creatures, footmen, assigned to night watch or late arrivals, kitchen maids prepping for the next day's breakfast, housemaids rising early to begin cleaning rooms before the family awoke. The butler awake intermittently to secure the house or handle emergencies. These servants became the invisible backbone of the night, performing unnoticed tasks that ensured the family awoke to a home that felt effortlessly perfect. Effortless, of course, meant someone else had worked for hours before sunrise. The eternal battle, tending the fires. The Georgian home depended on fires. Without them, rooms became frigid caves, water froze in basins, and aristocrats complained with the sorrowful intensity of people convinced cold air was a personal attack. Night servants tended fires constantly, adding coal, stirring embers, clearing ash before it stank of yesterday's mistakes, rekindling flames that died prematurely, checking fireplaces across multiple floors. It was a delicate art. Too much coal and the room overheated, too little and it chilled, too noisy and the fire tender risked waking the master, too slow and the house froze. Fires needed attention throughout the night, especially in winter, when a neglected hearth meant hours of miserable cold for the family and hours of blame aimed squarely at the servants. Guarding the house, footmen on night watch. Night watch was not glamorous. It involved patrolling dark hallways, listening for unusual sounds, and ensuring the doors were secure against intruders, stray animals, or drunken guests attempting to return at odd hours. Footmen on night watch relied on a keen hearing, soft footsteps, the ability to sit perfectly still without falling asleep, the mental strength to stare at darkness and pretend it wasn't terrifying. They were expected to let in late guests, assist family members who couldn't sleep, bring warm drinks upon request, keep an eye on smouldering fireplaces, respond instantly to bells. Yes, the bell system didn't sleep either. The house at night was full of unfamiliar shapes, shifting shadows and creaking noises. The wind howled down chimneys. Rats scurried behind walls. Floorboards groaned without warning. The bravest footman still had moments when he questioned every career decision that led him to standing alone in a dark corridor at 3 a.m. Kitchen work before the sun. While most people slept, kitchen maids prepared the foundation of the day ahead. Night tasks included setting dough to rise in cold kitchens, washing vegetables for breakfast dishes, preparing broths or porridges, cleaning pots too large or greasy for earlier attention, rekindling the enormous kitchen board fire. Boiling water. job that took ages and tested one's sanity. Their work had to be quiet, no clanking pans, no dropped spoons, because sound travelled at night as if the house itself were listening for mistakes. The cook often slept nearby, ready to unleash wrath if she sensed the kitchen falling behind schedule by even a minute. Housemaids and the pre-dawn sprint housemaids didn't stay awake all night, but they might as well have, because they rose before dawn. Their night work began when the world was still dark. They hurried through corridors lighting candles, opening shutters just enough to let in the earliest glow, and beginning the day's cleaning before anyone upstairs stirred. Their tasks included cleaning hearths while still warm, sweeping hallways, dusting surfaces that mysteriously attracted dust even in darkness, replacing water jugs and chamber pots, making beds the moment their occupants vacated them. In winter, housemaids worked in near darkness, their breath visible as they prepared rooms so cold they could have stored dairy products. Sleep, but only technically. Night duty servants had strange relationships with sleep. They grabbed it in slivers, an hour here, 20 minutes there, curled in corners or rushing to bunks when tasks briefly allowed. True, restorative sleep was a rarity. Night servants lived in a state of perpetual fatigue that blurred into their daytime duties. A hall boy might fall asleep standing up. A kitchen maid might nod off while peeling potatoes. A footman might close his eyes for a dangerously long blink and wake to find he'd tipped sideways. Everyone below stairs knew the signs of a servant who hadn't slept. Mistakes increased, tempers shortened, posture wilted. The housekeeper frowned before the servant even entered the room. But the work went on. The house demanded readiness at every hour. The psychology of night silence. The nighttime silence below stairs was unlike anything during the day. No bells, except when they did ring. No guests, no bustling footfalls, just the quiet murmur of a house at rest. For some servants, the stillness felt peaceful, for others, eerie. But for most, it was simply the backdrop of duty, something to endure, not savour. In that silence, servants became acutely aware of the house's breathing. The settling timbers, the flicker of low lamps, the whisper of wind under doors. Tasks performed at night felt more intimate, more secretive, as if servants were caretakers of a world that did not know they existed. Why night? Duties mattered. Without night workers, fires would die, breakfast would be late, the house would be cold, guests arriving at odd hours would find themselves stranded, the family would awaken to chaos instead of calm order. Night duty was the invisible glue that held the Georgian household together. It demanded strength, patience, discipline, and the ability to function at times of night usually reserved for poets, ghosts, or questionable decision-makers. Servants who worked the night never truly slept, because the house never truly slept. No matter how disciplined, coordinated, and perfection-driven a Georgian household was, mistakes still happened. Not often, because fear was a powerful motivator, but inevitably. And when they did, the results ranged from mildly embarrassing to catastrophically unforgettable. Dropping a plate wasn't just a mistake, it was character development. Below stairs, servants were trained to prevent disaster with near military precision. But Georgian houses were full of fire, breakable objects, hot pans, unstable furniture, unexpected guests, unpredictable animals, mismatched stair heights, and supervisors whose standards defied the laws of physics. Catastrophe, therefore, was not an if, but a when. Breakages, the sound that froze the soul. There was no sound more horrifying in a servant's life than the shatter of porcelain, the chime of broken crystal, or the dull, damning crack of a dropped bowl. It didn't matter whether it was a plate worth more than a servant's annual wages, a glass that had survived 5 generations, a teacup the mistress treasured irrationally, a serving dish that had been discontinued 50 years earlier. The reaction was always the same: silence, dread, and the internal sound of one's career dissolving like sugar in hot tea. Breaking something didn't automatically result in dismissal. but it nearly always resulted in a written entry in the household book, a scolding from the butler or housekeeper, a deduction from wages, a story that co-workers would retell for years as cautionary comedy. If a footman dropped a plate during dinner service, witnesses described time slowing down. The sound rang out across the dining room like a bell announcing societal collapse. Guests gasped. The mistress stiffened. The master raised one eyebrow with surgical precision, and the footman, who'd spent months perfecting his tray-holding posture, suddenly questioned every decision that brought him to this moment. Breakage was traumatic, but also unavoidable. Human hands get tired, floors are slippery, dishes sweat under candle heat, and sometimes fate simply has a cruel sense of humour. Kitchen fires, when dinner tried to fight back. Georgian kitchens were a hazardous blend of open flames, boiling liquids, flammable fabrics, and people moving very quickly. So it is no surprise that kitchen fires were among the most common catastrophes and the most terrifying. A kitchen fire could start from dripping fat igniting in a roasting pan, a towel falling too close to the hearth, a pot forgotten in the chaos of dinner service, sparks leaping out during fire stirring. A maid turning her back for one tragic second, the cook usually reacted first, often with a shriek that registered on multiple emotional frequencies. Kitchen maids scrambled for sand, water, or fire beaters. Smoke surged. The fire hissed. Someone shouted instructions that contradicted everyone else's instructions. If the blaze was caught early, disaster was certain. If not, the entire household mobilized. Footmen rushed buckets. The butler barked orders. The housekeeper assessed whether the linen supply would survive the ordeal, and the family upstairs might smell smoke and wonder whether the kitchen was experimenting with new recipes. Kitchen fires rarely burned houses down, but they ruined food, scalded servants, and created disaster narratives that lived on for decades. Food disasters. The cook's personal nightmares. Cooking for a Georgian household was high-stakes theatre. Meals were performances, and the cook was both maestro and scapegoat. Food disasters included soufflés that deflated faster than the cook's confidence, sauces oversalted to brine-like intensity, roasts underdone, overdone, or mysteriously both, pastries collapsing like poorly built architecture, trays accidentally spilled en route to the dining room, entire dishes dropped by trembling footmen at the moment of service. Each mistake carried its own unique horror. If breakfast eggs were overcooked, the master complained all morning. If fish arrived lukewarm, guests whispered. If a dessert fell apart on the table, it became a scandal. And if wine was served too warm or too cold, the butler suffered spiritual injury. Sometimes dishes failed because of accidents. Sometimes because the household demanded impossible timelines. Sometimes simply because kitchens are chaos incarnate, and a dozen servants working simultaneously creates enough confusion for culinary tragedy to thrive. Etiquette. Mishaps. Social disaster in motion. Etiquette was a fragile facade, and servants played a crucial role in maintaining it. When servants made errors during formal events, the consequences could be disproportionately dramatic. Common etiquette mishaps included addressing someone by the wrong title, serving dishes in the wrong order, dropping cutlery mid-meal, announcing guests incorrectly, accidentally interrupting a conversation, pouring wine too quickly, too slowly, or with too much enthusiasm. A single slip could ripple across a dinner table like social shockwaves. Aristocrats had long memories and short tolerance. A guest might raise an eyebrow, purse their lips, or deliver a glance so sharp it could slice silver. Servants felt these moments acutely. They were trained relentlessly to avoid them, but nerves, fatigue, and the sheer intensity of performing perfect service often created the perfect recipe for blunders. Unexpected guests, animals, and chaos of a different kind. Not all catastrophes were human-made. Georgian households hosted, visitors arriving without warning, children running wild, dogs stealing food, cats knocking over priceless objects, horses causing exterior disturbances, occasional wildlife intrusions, everything from bats to mice. Servants learned quickly that controlling animals, children, and unannounced guests required diplomacy, speed, stealth, and improvisation, skills rarely acknowledged but frequently needed. A footman chasing a dog through the drawing room was almost as common as a maid trying to discreetly remove a mouse without alarming the mistress. The aftermath: recovery, humour, and hard lessons. Once a catastrophe passed, the household entered a strange emotional sewer, relief mixed with exasperation. Servants repaired what they could. Broken items swept away, burned cloth replaced, ruined food remade, spilled wine discreetly blotted, emotional wounds bandaged by co-workers' sympathetic laughter. Below stairs, disasters became storytelling gold. A footman who dropped a plate became the subject of affectionate teasing for weeks. A kitchen fire became a legend. A mispronounced name circulated like folklore. Mistakes were painful, but they also bonded the staff. In shared catastrophe, humanity flourished. The unavoidable truth. In a world that demanded perfection, things still went wrong. And when they did, servants bore the responsibility, recovered the damage, absorbed the scolding, and carried on because the household had no pause button. Accidents didn't define them. Their ability to recover did. For modern listeners, life below stairs can feel like an endurance test designed by someone who disliked joy. Long hours, strict rules, low pay, endless tasks. Why would anyone willingly choose such a life? But to a Georgian servant, the answer was complex, practical, emotional, and deeply rooted in the realities of the time. The good news: you survived Georgian service. The bad news: you now understand why tea was a coping mechanism. To understand why so many accepted, even embraced, a life below stairs. We must step into a world where social class, economic necessity, and personal pride shaped every choice. Security in an uncertain world. The Georgian era was a time of instability for the working poor. Rural families struggled with crop failures, seasonal jobs, and harsh winters. Cities offered opportunity, but also poverty, disease, and unpredictable wages. In contrast, domestic service offered guaranteed meals, a roof over one's head, regular wages, however modest, stable employment, sometimes for years or decades in a society without social safety nets. The certainty of service held enormous appeal. Many families considered it a privilege when their children found work in a reputable household. A daughter becoming a housemaid or a son becoming a footman wasn't a step down, it was a lifeline. Servants might not have slept well, but they slept indoors. They might not have feasted, but they ate regularly. Survival mattered, and service provided it. Community, the family you didn't choose but grew to love. Life below stairs forged intense bonds. Servants worked, laughed, bickered, cried, celebrated, and endured together. They shared chores, shared meals, shared gossip, shared sleeping quarters, shared frustrations, shared victories. The servants' hall was a world unto itself, a micro-society with its own humour, politics, inside jokes, and alliances. A new servant might arrive as a stranger, but within weeks they became part of a tight-knit community bound by mutual reliance. These relationships often lasted a lifetime. Letters were exchanged when people moved on. Former co-workers attended each other's weddings. Some even remained connected to the households they once served. For all its hardship, service created belonging, a sense of purpose and pride. Despite the menial nature of the work, servants took immense pride in doing it well. A perfectly laid fire, an immaculate table setting, a flawlessly timed dinner service. These were achievements that required skill, discipline, and coordination. Many servants viewed themselves as professionals. They didn't merely work in a household, they helped run a complex, high-functioning machine. Their competence kept everything moving smoothly, often invisibly. And though praise was rare, the internal satisfaction remained real. Some even wore their roles like badges of honour. A butler, proud of his silver vault. A housekeeper, proud of her linen closets. A lady's maid, proud of mastering hairdressing techniques. A footman, proud of his gleaming livery and perfect posture. A cook, proud of feeding dozens without chaos. In a world where emotional rewards were scarce, skill became its own form of empowerment. Ambition and the myth of upward mobility. Many servants entered service hoping to climb the ranks, and sometimes they did. A scullery maid might become a kitchen maid, then a cook. A hall boy might become a footman, then under butler, then butler. But upward mobility was slow, difficult, and more myth than guarantee. Still, ambition mattered. It gave servants a sense of direction, a reason to endure long days, and a vision, however distant, of a better future. Even small promotions were monumental, granting better rooms, higher wages, or lighter workloads. Social mobility beyond service was rarer, but not impossible. A servant might save money to open a shop, marry into a trade, become a companion or nanny in a family's later years, receive patronage from a grateful employer. These stories became legends below stairs, testimonies that perseverance could pay off. The weight of social expectations. Many servants accepted the life because society expected them to. Their parents, neighbours and extended families came from similar backgrounds. Domestic service wasn't a mysterious world, it was a familiar path, passed down through generations. Children of servants often entered the same profession. Communities viewed service as respectable, honourable work that brought stability, morality and routine. To be a servant wasn't to be lesser, it was to be useful. Personal dreams quietly held. Amid the discipline and exhaustion, servants nurtured private dreams, a maid hoping to learn reading and writing, a footman planning to save enough to marry, a kitchen maid aspiring to run her own small bakery someday, a valet imagining opening a tailoring shop, a governess writing stories into the quiet hours. These dreams sustained them through long days and sleepless nights. The work was hard, but it funded hope. Dignity in the shadows. Despite being overlooked by the family and largely forgotten by history, Georgian servants knew their worth. They understood that the household couldn't function without them. The elegance upstairs existed because of the labour downstairs. Wealthy lives were stitched together by their invisible effort. In a small but powerful way, this gave servants dignity. Not public dignity, not applause, not recognition, but the quiet dignity of people who know their work matters. And so, why did they stay? They stayed for security, community, pride, aspiration, identity, necessity, habit. They stayed because the world outside the estate walls was often less forgiving than the world within. They stayed because below stairs, harsh as it was, made sense in ways the wider world did not. The final reflection: to survive. Georgian service was to endure hardship, humour, exhaustion, camaraderie, and the strange satisfaction of belonging to something larger than oneself. It required strength of body, resilience of mind, and flexibility of spirit. And at the end of it all, they brewed tea. Because sometimes the only rational response to centuries of social inequality, endless work and ringing bells was a hot drink and a moment of peace.